Some of the most unsettling stories are not about what we know happened, but about what we can't explain. They're the stories that take place in the vast, quiet wilderness where a person can be there 1 second and gone the next. We're not talking about simple cases of getting lost. We're talking about disappearances that defy all logic, where children are found miles away in impossible terrain with no memory of how they got there, and adults return with tales so strange they sound like they're from another world. Today, we're going to look at 3 cases from the deep woods of Arkansas, each one a puzzle with missing pieces that leave a chilling, permanent question mark. These are stories that make you wonder what really is out there just beyond the edge of the trail. On the morning of the 16th of June, 1946, the Van Alst family pulled up to a rented cabin in Devil's Den State Park in western Arkansas. It was the start of what was supposed to be a perfect summer week. The father, his 8-year-old daughter Catherine, and her 2 older brothers were all excited to get their vacation started. After they finished unpacking their bags and getting settled in, the first thing on the agenda was to go for a swim. The father led the kids down a well-worn path to the local swimming area. It was a picturesque spot, a creek that widened and deepened as it flowed up against the side of a man-made dam. The sun was out, other families were around, and the sound of kids laughing and splashing filled the air. As soon as they got there, Catherine and her 2 brothers couldn't wait. They kicked off their shoes and jumped right into the cool water. They started playing games, splashing each other, and joining in with some of the other children who were already there. Their father found a comfortable spot on the bank, a place where he could keep an eye on all 3 of them, and he just sat back to watch them have fun. Now, this swimming area was generally safe, but there was one particular section everyone knew to be careful of. Right up against the concrete wall of the dam, the water got very deep very quickly. It was an area that the stronger, more confident swimmers enjoyed, but parents made sure to tell the younger kids to stay in the shallower parts. Catherine was only 8, and she wasn't a particularly strong swimmer. She was mostly splashing around where her feet could touch the bottom. But at one point, as she was playing, she started to drift. Without even realizing it, she had floated over into the deep section right next to the dam. Her father, who was watching her brothers for a moment, didn't see it happen. Her brothers, caught up in their own game, didn't notice either. But there was someone else there, a woman who was also visiting the campground. She didn't know the Van Alst family, but she happened to be standing near the edge of the water, and she saw what was happening. She saw little Catherine start to struggle, her head bobbing beneath the surface. Without a second of hesitation, the woman reached into the water and pulled Catherine out, setting her back on her feet on solid ground. Catherine was sputtering a bit, but she was perfectly fine. The woman knelt down and spoke to her calmly. She said, "You really need to be more careful. You shouldn't be swimming in the deep end if you're not a strong swimmer." Catherine nodded, a little scared, but okay, and said she understood. Just then, Catherine's father heard their voices. He looked over and saw his daughter, who he thought was safely in the shallow water, talking to a complete stranger. His parental instincts immediately kicked in. He made a sound to get their attention and waved in their direction, trying to signal to the woman, "What are you doing talking to my daughter?" The woman looked up and saw the concern on his face. She must have been a mother herself, because she immediately understood. She smiled reassuringly and called out to him. She said, "Oh no, everything is totally fine. I was just helping your daughter out of the water. She's okay, everything is fine." Hearing this, Catherine's father turned his attention to his daughter. He said, "Hey, you have to be more careful. Don't go in the deep end." And Catherine, still a little shaken, just said, "Okay, Dad." Instead of getting back in the water, Catherine decided to do something else. She walked over to the backside of the dam. This wasn't a dangerous, steep drop-off like you might imagine. The outflow side of this particular dam was a gradual slope made of huge weathered boulders. It was a popular spot for the kids at the campground to climb and explore. They treated it like a natural jungle gym, and their parents could easily watch them from the swimming area. So, Catherine started scrambling over the big rocks, and her father settled back into his routine of watching his kids. He'd look over at his two sons who were still in the water, and then he'd glance over to the dam and see Catherine climbing on the rocks. He kept going back and forth, making sure he had eyes on all three of them. It was just a few seconds at a time. A glance at the boys, a glance at Catherine. A glance at the boys, a glance at Catherine. But then, at one point, he looked at his sons in the water, and when he looked back to where Catherine was on the rocks, she was just gone. He stood up straight, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He walked over to the edge of the dam, thinking maybe she had just climbed all the way to the bottom and was out of his line of sight. Maybe she was crouched down behind one of the big boulders. But when he got to the edge and looked all the way down the slope of rocks, she wasn't there. He scanned the entire area, left and right. Nothing. He started to feel a real sense of panic. This is impossible, he thought to himself. I just saw her on those rocks. It was literally seconds ago. Where could she have gone? He turned back to his sons, who were still splashing around in the creek, and he yelled, "Hey, have you seen Catherine?" They both shook their heads and said no, they hadn't seen her. He then looked for the woman who had helped Catherine out of the water earlier. He found her and quickly walked over. He asked her, "Have you seen my daughter?" The woman looked concerned and said, "No, the last I saw her, she was playing on the rocks. I don't know where she went." Before long, Catherine's father was screaming her name. His voice was raw with fear, echoing through the park. His panic was contagious. He quickly enlisted the help of everybody at the campground who was nearby. People immediately dropped what they were doing to help look for his daughter. Complete strangers were jumping into the swimming area above the dam, feeling around in the murky water. Other people were searching the creek bed below the dam. Every bush, every cluster of trees, the entire area was being searched by this impromptu group of concerned campers. But there was absolutely no sign of the little girl. After about an hour of this frantic, fruitless searching, Catherine's father knew he needed more help. He ran to find a park ranger and got the police involved. The search that followed was massive. For 2 full days, search and rescue teams, police officers, and volunteers scoured the incredibly thick forest that surrounded the dam. They searched day and night, but they found no trace of Catherine. Not a footprint, not a piece of her clothing, nothing. Authorities started to reconsider their initial assumptions. They decided it was far more likely that she had somehow fallen back into the water and drowned, either above or below the dam, than it was that she had just wandered off into the dense woods. It just made more sense, given where she was last seen. And so, they shifted the focus of the entire operation. They brought in equipment and began the long process of draining the 2 large sections of water, the swimming hole above the dam and the creek pool below it. Everyone held their breath, preparing for the worst, expecting that as the water level dropped, they would find her body at the bottom. But when both sections were completely drained, there was nothing there. She wasn't in the water. This was a devastating blow. It meant that she had to be somewhere in the miles and miles of unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. So, once again, the search parties went back into the forest, their hopes dwindling with each passing hour. On June 22nd, 6 full days after Catherine had vanished from the rocks on the dam, a small group of searchers was pushing through the woods. They were a long, long way from where the search had started. They were 7 miles deep into the forest as the crow flies, slowly making their way up the side of a steep mountain. They were exhausted, but they kept going, yelling Catherine's name into the dense trees. As they were walking, they suddenly stopped. Ahead of them, a small figure had just walked out of the mouth of a cave. It was a little girl, and she was wearing only a bathing suit. She looked down the mountainside at the group of stunned men, and in a perfectly calm voice, she just said, "Here I am." The searchers couldn't believe their eyes. It was Catherine. They rushed up the mountain to her. Besides a few scratches on her arms and some bug bites on her legs, she seemed to be perfectly fine. In fact, the men who found her would later say that she was eerily calm. It was like she was just waking up from a long dream, not like a child who had been lost and alone in the wilderness for nearly a week. She was soon reunited with her family, who were overwhelmed with relief and disbelief. They couldn't believe she was still alive after all this time. They immediately brought her to a hospital where doctors gave her a thorough examination. And their conclusion was just as baffling. They confirmed what the searchers had seen. Besides some superficial cuts and a few bug bites, she was physically fine. 2 days later, she was discharged from the hospital, as if nothing had happened. Let's just take a moment to really understand how impossible this is. This was an 8-year-old girl who had never spent any real time in the woods before. This trip to Devil's Den State Park was her first real exposure to that kind of environment. And somehow, she had survived on her own, out in the wild, for 6 days and 6 nights with nothing but a bathing suit on. What's even more incredible is that in the remote mountainous area where she was found, there were no known sources of fresh, potable water anywhere nearby. Yet, when the doctors examined her, she was determined to be relatively well hydrated. And she had only lost a couple of pounds. Then, there's the staggering distance she covered. While she was found 7 miles away from where she went missing, that's a straight line on a map. When you're in the wild, you don't walk in perfectly straight lines. There are too many obstructions. There are mountains to climb, ravines to cross, thickets of trees and brush to get around. You end up zigging and zagging constantly. Search and rescue experts analyzed the terrain and estimated that the minimum real distance she would have had to travel to get from the dam to that cave was about 30 miles. And she did it all barefoot. Catherine's survival defied every established search and rescue model for an 8-year-old child lost in the wild. She was found in a location so far outside the standard search boundaries that nobody would have ever expected to find her there. Basically, by all logical accounts, she should have died. When authorities gently questioned her, trying to piece together what had happened, her answers only made the mystery deeper. They asked her, "How did you do this? How did you survive?" And she just looked at them and said, "I don't know." She said she had no memory of how she got lost in the first place. Her only clear memory from that first day was falling asleep on a patch of warm grass. Her very next memory was waking up inside that cave on day 6, just before the searchers found her. She had no idea what happened in the 5 days in between. She had no idea how she traveled 30 miles, how she found water, or how she found food. Some people tried to rationalize it. They said, maybe this is just a really, really weird case where she got incredibly lucky. But others have a darker theory. They think that something in the forest must have chased her. That pure adrenaline kicked in, forcing her to run those 30 miles to the safety of that cave. And because the experience was so deeply traumatic, her mind simply erased the memory to protect itself. But like with so many of these stories, what we're left with are a lot more questions than answers. Fast forward a few decades to the 29th of April 2001, a 6-year-old girl named Haley Zaga was on a hike with her grandparents. They were in a very rural part of Arkansas called the Upper Buffalo Wilderness Area. Now, for an area to be officially designated as a wilderness area, it means that no vehicles of any kind are allowed to come through there. That makes it incredibly remote, incredibly quiet, and incredibly wild. Haley and her grandparents had taken a trail that led them up to the top of a high bluff, about 200 feet higher than where they had started their hike. When they got to the top, the view was breathtaking. They stood at an incredible overlook, looking down over a winding river and a valley of green trees. At about 11 in the morning, after taking in the view, they turned around to start the trip back down. By about 11:30, they were making their way down the trail when Haley spotted something off to the side of the path. It was a waterfall cascading down the rocks. She got really excited and immediately wanted to go see it up close. She asked her grandparents, "Can we please go check out that waterfall?" Her grandparents looked over and sized up the situation. It seemed like the only way they could actually get down to the base of the waterfall would be by literally climbing down a tree and descending over the edge of a small cliff. It was a route that the grandparents just did not feel comfortable letting their 6-year-old granddaughter attempt. And so they had to tell her no. They said, "Haley, we need to keep going. We're not going to go check out that waterfall." Haley, being a determined 6-year-old, really wanted to see it, and she wasn't happy about being told no. She wanted to get her way, so she threw a little tantrum. She sat right down in the middle of the trail, crossed her arms, and said, "Well, if you're not going to take me to the waterfall, then I'm not going to move. You're going to have to carry me." Her grandparents sighed. They said, "No, we're not going to carry you. You need to be a big girl. We need you to stand up and start walking with us." But Haley refused to budge. So her grandparents decided to try a different tactic. They said, "Okay, we're going to leave you here then." And they turned around and they kept walking down the trail. They didn't go far at all. They were still completely in her view, and it was broad daylight. They would walk a few feet and then turn around, fully expecting their granddaughter to give up, stand up, and start begrudgingly walking after them. And after a moment, she did. Haley stood up and called out, "Okay, wait for me." And she started walking. Her grandparents were relieved and said, "All right, let's go." So they started walking ahead of Haley. But as they walked, Haley started to slow down more and more and more. Her grandparents could tell she was doing it on purpose. She was still upset, and she was trying to be frustrating, intentionally taking as long as she possibly could. But her grandparents were patient. They made sure they always kept her in their view. They would walk a little ways, then turn around, and she'd be right there behind them. They'd walk a little further, turn around, and she'd still be there. They did this over and over again. And then, at some point, they walked a few steps, turned around to check on her, and she wasn't there. The grandparents' hearts dropped. They immediately ran back up the trail, looking around for Haley. Their first thought was that she had probably just darted behind a tree to hide, just to be a little more frustrating and continue her game. So, at first, they weren't that worried. They started looking behind the biggest trees and rocks, calling out for her. They said, "Come on, we really have to leave. You have to come out now, we have to go." But there was no answer from Haley. All they heard was the sound of the wind in the trees. It was just silence. She was just totally gone. For the next 90 minutes, the grandparents ran frantically up and down that stretch of trail, screaming for Haley. They searched everywhere they could think of, but they never found her. Finally, in a state of pure panic, they ran all the way down the mountain and called the police. What followed was the largest search and rescue mission in the history of the state of Arkansas. It was an enormous operation launched for one little girl, Haley Zaga. It included hundreds of searchers on the ground, covering every inch of the rugged terrain. There were 8 different canine dog teams brought in to try and pick up her scent. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the wilderness from the air. There were firefighters, local police, and even the National Guard was called in to help. But after 2 full days of this incredible, exhaustive search, really no progress had been made. The only potential clue they had found came from one of the dog teams. The dogs had tracked Haley's scent from where she was last seen on the trail all the way up to a nearby road. And at the edge of the road, the dogs just stopped. The scent was gone. Unfortunately, what that usually tells investigators is a very grim story. It looked like Haley had been picked up by someone in a car. But then, 51 hours into the ordeal, something incredible happened. There were 2 searchers who were working well outside of the primary search area. They were about 2 miles away from the spot where she had gone missing, in an area that hadn't been a high priority. As they were walking along a creek, they spotted her. She was just sitting there next to a small brook with her feet dangling in the cool water. When she saw the two men, she just kind of waved. They approached her cautiously, and one of them asked, "Are you Haley Zaga?" And she looked up at them and said, "Yeah." She had a couple of small scratches on her arm and on her face, but overall, she seemed to be okay. And just like that, Haley was reunited with her overjoyed family. She was then brought to a local hospital to be checked out and kept for observation. After Haley had rested and regained some of her strength, investigators sat down with her to ask her what had happened. Her story was strange. She said that she was walking behind her grandparents and that she just looked down at her feet for a second. But when she looked up again, not only were her grandparents gone, but the trail was gone too. She said she was suddenly looking at a solid wall of trees. She didn't know where she was or how she had gotten there. And since she was only 6 years old, her first instinct wasn't to stop and look around or to yell for help. Instead, she just kept walking deeper into the woods in a direction that she didn't recognize. She said she walked and walked and walked, but she never found the trail again. She told them that pretty soon it started to get dark, and she found a place to sleep on top of the bluff where she'd gone missing. Then, the next day, when the sun came up, she walked down from the bluff and eventually made it to the river. She then walked along the river until she found a small cave, and she slept there for the second night. And then, the next day, after she got up, she was found by the searchers. After she gave this explanation, the investigators had a lot of questions. One of the main ones was, if you were sleeping up on the bluff on that first night, then why couldn't the helicopters see you? The helicopters were flying over that bluff all night long. They were equipped with thermal imaging cameras that can easily pick up the heat signature of a person on the ground. They should have seen you. So they asked her, "Are you sure that's where you were?" And she nodded and said, "Yeah, that's where Alicia told me to stay." The investigators were confused. They asked, "Who's Alicia?" Haley answered matter-of-factly. She said, "Oh, she's my imaginary friend. I met her up on the bluff." Instantly, the investigators and Haley's parents all came to the same conclusion. Okay, she's clearly just coping with this very traumatic event by creating an imaginary friend to help her through it. It was a simple psychological defense mechanism. So they didn't ask any more questions about this imaginary friend. Instead, they continued to ask her practical questions about how she got from the place where she was lost to the place where she was found. They said, "Okay, Haley, how did you get down from the bluffs?" Because there's really only one safe way down, and the trail can be hard to find, especially if you're already off the path. And Haley said, "Well, Alicia brought me to a trail, and she led me down the bluffs. She stood right in front of me the whole way and made sure that I didn't fall forward." Hearing this, her parents and the investigators started to exchange glances. This was a lot more detailed than a typical imaginary friend story. If this person was physically right in front of her, propping her up, maybe this wasn't an imaginary friend after all. So they asked Haley, "Can you describe what Alicia looks like?" And Haley said, "Sure. She has black hair and brown eyes. She's a little bit shorter than me. She's 4 years old. She likes to tell jokes and she likes to sing songs." And then right there in the hospital room, Haley began singing some of the songs that she said she had learned from Alicia. She even started telling some of the jokes she had learned from Alicia. Even though Haley was giving this incredibly vivid description of this 4-year-old girl named Alicia who was running around on the bluffs with her, it just couldn't possibly be real. And so, Haley's parents and the investigators went back to their original theory. They decided to treat Alicia as just an imaginary friend, a simple coping mechanism for a scared little girl. The investigators finished up their interview with Haley, getting as much information as they could about her journey from the bluffs down to the river. And then, because Haley was physically fine, they said, "Okay, you're good to go." Haley's case was a really big deal in Arkansas. It was all over the local news, especially after she was found safe. Her hospital interview, where she mentioned her imaginary friend named Alicia, who had helped her get down the bluffs and had basically taken care of her, that part of the story was put into print in the newspapers. And after it was published, some local readers with long memories realized something chilling. They realized there was another little girl who had gone missing in the exact same spot as Haley 23 years earlier. That little girl had been 4 years old. She had black hair and brown eyes. Her name was Alana, and she had died on those bluffs. After this incredible connection was made, the story got national media attention. Suddenly, news outlets were suggesting that this imaginary friend wasn't imaginary at all. They were saying it was actually the spirit of Alana and that she had acted as Haley's guardian angel. In fact, Haley was even brought on the TV show Dateline to talk about her mysterious friend. Just this year, Haley, who is now 25 years old, posted a video to her own YouTube channel where she tells her side of the story of what happened over those 51 hours she was gone. And in the story, she talks about her imaginary friend. She says, before this happened, I never had an imaginary friend. And afterwards, I never had one again. But at that time, Alicia was very, very real to me. And I don't know who or what she was, but she saved my life. In September of 2012, a 53-year-old woman named Linda Ortega went to visit her brother, Eddie Huff, in St. Joe, Arkansas. St. Joe is another very rural part of the state, and it's located about a mile away from the Buffalo River National Park. This park is a huge expanse of thickly forested, mountainous land, and there are hundreds of small creeks, rivers, and ponds strewn throughout it. On Saturday, September 22nd, Linda and her brother Eddie decided to go for a walk in the park. Eddie had apparently heard from a friend about a great fishing spot hidden somewhere off the main trails, and he wanted to go try and find it. So, in their search for this specific spot, they stepped off of a marked trail and started making their way through the woods. It wasn't long before they realized they had gotten turned around. But it was still broad daylight and they weren't too worried. They figured, okay, we'll find the trail again soon. But as the hours passed and the sun started to set, they still had not found the trail. They had to face the fact that they were badly lost. And then, some very strange things started to happen. We only have a marginal understanding of the full sequence of events because of what came next. What we do know for sure is that the brother and sister were together on that first day they went missing. We know they were still together the following day, on Sunday, still wandering around looking for a way out of the park. And we know that by the end of that day, they were still lost. Then, on the next day, which was Monday, we know that the pair separated. Because on Monday, Eddie re-emerged from the park completely alone. He just walked out of the woods, hopped into his car like nothing unusual was going on, drove back to his house, and walked inside. His family, who had been frantic with worry, saw him and rushed over. They said, "Where have you been? You've been missing for 2 days. We've been calling you. Where have you been? And most importantly, where is Linda?" And Eddie just looked at them calmly and said, "Oh, everything's fine. I dropped Linda off at a relative's house. She's fine too." His family was just staring at him, completely bewildered. They said, "Do you not understand that you've been missing for 3 days?" He just seemed to be in a daze, trying to tell them over and over that everything was perfectly fine. But as they pressed him for more details, asking him specifically, what were you doing? Specifically, how did you get lost? Specifically, what time did you drop Linda off? They needed to know all the details, and as they did that, Eddie started to seem confused. It was like he was slowly realizing that, oh my goodness, I actually don't know what happened. I don't remember. So his family called the relative that Eddie had claimed he dropped Linda off with. When the relative picked up the phone, they confirmed the family's worst fears. They said, "No, we don't have Linda here. I have not spoken to Eddie, and I have not spoken to Linda in days." And so the family turned back to a now very distressed Eddie, and they asked him again, "Where is Linda?" And this time, Eddie just looked at them with fear in his eyes and said, "I have no idea." The family immediately contacted the police, and a massive search was launched for Linda. They looked all over the park for days and days, but there was no sign of her anywhere. People were starting to get really worried, fearing the worst. And then on Thursday, 3 days after Eddie had mysteriously reemerged from the park, and 5 days after they had originally gone missing, there was a breakthrough. Some searchers who were on ATVs were about 2 miles away from the entrance of the park, navigating through a very thick, dense area of the forest. And that's when they found Linda. And she was alive. Initially, just like her brother Eddie, she seemed to have no real idea what was going on. She said she didn't understand how she got to where she was, and she was just really, really confused. So they brought her back to a hospital and put her under a doctor's care. And thankfully, she ended up being physically fine. But as she was laying in the hospital bed, resting, she started to kind of come to, and her memories started flooding back. And she began to tell the story of what happened to her out there. And it was absolutely unbelievable. She said that she and Eddie had gone into the park to find that fishing spot. At some point, they had stepped off the trail thinking they were going to find it easily, but they didn't. They got turned around and became lost. She said they were confident they were going to find the trail and get out on the same day, but they didn't. And so the sun went down, and they were forced to spend the night out in the wild. The next morning, they got up and they continued to look around. They were yelling for help, but there was no one around. They were in this very dense, remote part of the forest, and all day long, again, they were looking for the trail, and they just couldn't find it. And so that night, for a second time, they had to sleep out in the wild. Linda said that her memory, starting with the next day, which was Monday, started to get really foggy. She said she remembered waking up, and for some reason, she just got up and started running frantically into the woods. She thinks it might have been because she thought Eddie was hurt, and she was running to try and get help. And so it must have been around this time that Eddie, in his own dazed and confused state, got up and somehow managed to meander his way successfully out of the park. Meanwhile, Linda said she was just running like a maniac, deeper and deeper into the middle of the woods, screaming for help from anyone, even though she was in the middle of nowhere. And then, miraculously, she says she saw a group of people way off in the distance. It looked like a group of hikers. She was so relieved. She started yelling for them and waving her arms, trying to get their attention. She said they all stopped what they were doing, and they turned to look at her. But they didn't show any sign that they had actually heard her. They weren't waving back. They weren't calling out to her. They were just looking at her. Linda said she thought that was pretty odd, but she was desperate. So she just kept on running towards them, screaming and yelling and trying to get their attention. She said when she got about 100 meters away from them, instead of them reciprocating her waves or making any sound, they all just ducked behind trees. It looked like they were trying to hide from her. Linda said this was the first time that she felt really, really unsettled by what was happening. But she was desperate for help, and so she just kept walking slowly towards them. She got to about 50 meters away when they all poked their heads out from behind the trees and looked out at her, and then quickly poked their heads back in again like they were playing a terrifying game of peekaboo. They were clearly not trying to interact with her. Linda said she felt really scared now, and she stopped and began slowly backpedaling away from this weird group of people who were hiding behind trees. And so, while keeping her eyes on the general area where she knew they were hiding, she backed away all the way back to about 100, maybe 150 meters away again. And at that point, the group came out from behind the trees and just continued to stare at Linda in complete silence. Linda said at this point, she was absolutely terrified. She didn't know who or what those things were, but she knew they were not there to help her. And then she said her memory got really foggy again, because all of a sudden, her next memory is of her laying on the ground in a pitch black forest. Her brother was not near her, and she was hearing footsteps. She believed it was this group of people or things that were walking towards her, but it was so dark she couldn't see anything at all. And she said that all night long she just lay there frozen as she heard the sounds of these people or things walking around the perimeter of where she was laying, totally exposed in the middle of the forest. Linda said her memories from this point until the moment she was rescued are all mixed together, a confusing jumble of fear and disorientation. But she said she had one specific memory that really stood out to her because it was so terrifying. She said on one of the last mornings she was out there, she woke up, she was laying on the ground. She opened her eyes, and it was still dark, but the sun was just starting to come up, so there was enough light that she could begin to make out the shapes and layout of the forest around her. So she sat up, and she immediately got the distinct sense that she was being watched. But she didn't know by who or from where the feeling was coming. She just had this powerful, intuitive sense that eyes were on her. And as she was feeling this way, she heard a slight movement coming from off to her right. She turned her head, and standing next to a tree, about maybe 20 meters away, was the dark silhouette of a man. He was just staring at her. He had no discernible features. He was just a shadowy, human-shaped figure. And so she's horrified. And then, as her eyes adjusted, she realized there was another one. And she looked at that one, and then realized there was another one. And another one. And another one. They were all around her, standing silently by the trees. They were forming a circle around her, these dark, shadowy figures, all just looking in at her. She was so scared she couldn't even scream. And as she's looking around at all of them, it seemed like they registered that she could now see them. And at that exact moment, they all turned and started running away into the forest in all different directions. She said after that, she has no idea what the sequence of events was or what happened to her at all. All she knows is that the whole time she was out there, she was terrified. She constantly felt like there were people watching her from just out of sight in the woods. And then, at some point, rescuers showed up, and she was saved. Linda's totally bizarre account of what happened, combined with her brother Eddie's equally strange behavior and memory loss, completely baffled investigators. They really didn't know what to make of this story. How did Eddie, in a dazed state, manage to find his way out of the park, and why did he have a false memory of Linda being safe at a relative's house? And who, or what, were the silent, hiding people that Linda was seeing in the woods? And why can't either of them remember 90% of their own experience? One common theory is that they must have eaten some wild berries or some other plant that had hallucinogenic properties, and that they were literally just hallucinating the whole time. However, if you follow along with the wider phenomenon of these strange disappearances, you know there are lots of other examples of people who go missing in the woods of North America that never ingest any food or any liquid at all, so there's no possibility of a hallucinogen in their system. And they still have experiences that are eerily similar to what Linda and Eddie went through. So, how do you explain that? What these stories leave us with is the unsettling feeling that sometimes the simplest explanation just isn't enough. Let me know what you think about today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a complete playlist of true crime episodes waiting for you right now. Somewhere in the forests of North America, there are still gaps in these stories. The missing hours, the lost memories, the missing people, and whatever is waiting for them out there might still be there right now. Thank you for listening. See you next time. In 1957, in the quiet, hard-working town of Akron, Ohio, a 31-year-old man named Larry Bader was trying his best to build a good life. He had a wife, Mary Lou, and 3 young kids who were his entire world, By all accounts, Larry was a wonderful father and a loving husband. He was the kind of guy who would do anything for his family. But there was one area where Larry consistently struggled, and that was business. He had the heart of an entrepreneur, always brimming with new ideas and big dreams. Over the years, he had poured his energy and what little money they had into one venture after another. But each one, for one reason or another, had failed to take off. These failures left the Bader family in a deep hole of debt. And so, Larry had to put his entrepreneurial dreams on the shelf. He couldn't afford to take any more risks. He needed a steady paycheck to keep a roof over his family's head and food on the table. He took a job as a cookware salesman for a local company. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't his passion, but it paid the bills. The work was a daily reminder of his failed ambitions, and it wore on him. To escape the pressure and the quiet disappointment of his life, Larry had found a sanctuary. That sanctuary was Lake Erie, about an hour's drive north of their home. On the weekends, if Mary Lou was okay with managing the kids on her own, Larry would pack up his gear and his small boat and just disappear. Out on the water with a fishing line in his hand, he could disconnect from the bills, from the sales quotas, and from the life he felt he was supposed to be living. It was his way of resetting, of finding a small piece of peace. On Friday, the 15th of March, 1957, Larry came to his wife with his usual weekend request. He told her he really needed to get away, to head up to the lake and do some fishing. Mary Lou, as always, was supportive. She knew how much he needed these trips. But this time, she was worried. She told him she had heard the weather forecast, and it wasn't good. A big storm was supposed to roll in over the lake. She asked him if he was sure it was a good idea to go. Larry just smiled and waved it off. He told her not to worry, that the news always exaggerated these things. He said the storms were never as bad as they predicted, and he would be perfectly fine. And so, with that reassurance, he kissed Mary Lou goodbye, he kissed each of his 3 children, grabbed his fishing gear, and headed out the door. He hopped in his truck and drove north towards the calm, gray waters of Lake Erie. That night, the storm that Mary Lou had worried about crashed down on Lake Erie with a vengeance. It was far worse than anyone had predicted. The winds howled, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the lake's surface into a violent, churning mess. The following morning, as the storm began to subside, the Coast Guard was out on patrol, surveying the damage. And that's when they found it. A small boat, bobbing aimlessly in the waves. It was Larry Bader's boat. They pulled up alongside it and saw that it had some minor damage, like it had been battered around by the storm. One of the oars was missing. And so was Larry. A massive search was launched immediately. The Coast Guard scoured the lake and the shoreline for days, hoping to find any sign of him. But there was nothing. Larry Bader had simply vanished into the storm. After weeks of searching turned up no body and no new clues, the authorities had to make a difficult call. Larry Bader was officially declared dead, lost to the unforgiving waters of Lake Erie. His family, though they had no body to bury, held a funeral to say their goodbyes. Mary Lou was devastated, but she had to be strong for her children. She cashed in Larry's life insurance policy. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to pay off their debts and give her and the kids a chance to start over, to build a new life without their father and husband. Fast forward 8 long years to 1965. Life had moved on for the Bader family. Larry's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Pekka, was in Chicago for a sporting goods show. She was with a friend, and they were wandering through the massive convention hall, looking at all the latest fishing rods, camping gear, and hunting equipment. As they walked, they noticed a large crowd gathered around one of the exhibits off to the side. Curious, they decided to see what all the excitement was about. They worked their way through the group of people until they could see what was happening in the center. There, a man was putting on an archery demonstration. He had a big, thick mustache and was wearing a black eye patch over one eye. He stood with a confident posture, holding a bow, and was methodically shooting arrows at a target about 30 feet away. Suzanne and her friend watched for a few minutes, and it quickly became clear why this man had drawn such a crowd. He was an incredible archer. Arrow after arrow flew from his bow and landed squarely in the bullseye. He almost never missed. It was a mesmerizing display of skill. As they stood there watching, Suzanne's friend started looking more closely at the archer, not just at his skill, but at his face. After a moment, he turned to Suzanne with a strange look. He said to her, "Hey, doesn't that guy look exactly like your uncle? The one who disappeared on Lake Erie?" Suzanne was taken aback. Her Uncle Larry had been gone for 8 years, and it was strange to hear him mentioned so suddenly. But she turned her gaze back to the man with the eye patch, and this time she looked at him differently. And then she saw it. The resemblance was uncanny. Even with the mustache and the eye patch, the shape of his face, his build, the way he carried himself, it was a spitting image of her Uncle Larry. And then another piece clicked into place in her mind. Her Uncle Larry had also been known for being a phenomenal archer. It was one of his favorite hobbies. Here was a man who looked just like him and had the exact same rare talent. The coincidence felt too big to ignore. As soon as the demonstration ended and the crowd started to thin out, Suzanne and her friend rushed over to the man. Suzanne's heart was pounding. She walked right up to him and said, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader. He went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." The man looked at her, and a polite, slightly confused smile crossed his face. He told her he was sorry, but he didn't know anyone named Larry Bader. He said his name was John Johnson, but everyone called him Fritz. He repeated that he was sorry, but he couldn't help her. But Suzanne wasn't convinced. The more she looked at him, the more certain she became. The denial didn't shake her. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, you are Larry Bader. I am positive you're my uncle." At this point, Fritz's politeness started to wear a little thin. He was firm, but not rude. He reiterated that he was not her uncle. He told her he didn't know who Larry Bader was, that he'd never been to Lake Erie. He tried to explain his life to her, to show her how impossible it was. He said he lived in Omaha, Nebraska, with his wife and his kids. He told her he was a sports journalist on television in Omaha and also worked as a consultant for archery companies, which is why he was at the show. He looked at her, completely bewildered, and said he just didn't understand why she thought he was her uncle, but he wasn't. And with that, Fritz turned and walked away, leaving Suzanne and her friends standing there in shock. But they were not deterred. Not in the slightest. They were now more convinced than ever that this man was Larry Bader, and he was either lying or something very strange was going on. They ran to find a payphone. Suzanne called her 2 other uncles, Larry's brothers. She frantically explained what had just happened, how she had found a man who was the spitting image of their long-lost brother. Her uncles were skeptical at first, but the conviction in Suzanne's voice was enough. They told her to stay put. They booked the next flight to Chicago and flew out that very night. The next morning, Suzanne and her friend met her 2 uncles at the sporting goods show. They all went straight to the archery exhibit. And sure enough, there he was. Fritz Johnson, with his eye patch and mustache, doing another one of his incredible archery demonstrations. They waited patiently until there was a break. Then the 4 of them, Suzanne, her friend, and Larry Bader's 2 brothers, walked over to him. As soon as the brothers saw Fritz up close, any doubt they might have had vanished. Despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, despite the 8 years that had passed, they knew this was their brother. They approached him calmly. One of the brothers spoke, telling him that they knew he was saying he wasn't Larry, but the resemblance was just too strong to be a coincidence. He explained that they had been searching for their brother for a very long time, Then he pulled out some papers. He told Fritz that they had Larry's old military records, which included a full set of his fingerprints. He asked Fritz, "Please, just humor us. Come with us to the police station and get your fingerprints taken. It's the only way to prove to us that you aren't our brother." It would be a huge favor and would finally give them some closure. Fritz was clearly annoyed. He didn't want to do it. This whole thing was a ridiculous distraction. But he looked at the hopeful, desperate faces of these strangers and sighed. He figured it was the quickest way to end this bizarre situation. He said, "Fine. I'll go to the police station. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and then we can all put this behind us." And so, later that day, they all left the sporting goods show and went to a local Chicago police station. Fritz Johnson sat patiently while an officer rolled his fingertips in ink and pressed them onto a card. The officer then took the new prints and compared them with the ones from Larry Bader's military file. After a few minutes of careful examination, the officer looked up at Fritz, and he told him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard those words, he was in a state of pure disbelief. It wasn't a moment of revelation for him. No flood of lost memories came rushing back. In fact, it was the exact opposite. His mind was a blank slate when it came to Larry Bader. He immediately started trying to make sense of it, racking his brain, searching for any inconsistency in his own memory, any clue that his life as Fritz Johnson wasn't real. But he found nothing. All he could remember was a continuous, unbroken life. He had memories of being a young child named Fritz Johnson, growing up and living his life all the way up to that present moment in the police station. But now he was being told that the vast majority of those memories were a complete fabrication. He was never a child named Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader, a man from Ohio, and he had only become Fritz Johnson 8 years ago. The timeline of what actually happened is still murky, but investigators were able to piece together a rough sketch. It seems that just a few days, or maybe a few months, after Larry Bader disappeared on Lake Erie, a man calling himself Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska. He walked into a local restaurant and asked for a job. He provided documents that seemed to prove his identity, and nobody had any reason to question him. He seemed like a completely normal, friendly guy. There was nothing about his behavior that raised any red flags. Over the next 8 years, Fritz wove himself into the very fabric of the Omaha community. He got married to a woman there. He had a child with her and adopted another. He was a good husband and a good father. He eventually left his job as a bartender and, through his charisma and talent, landed an amazing job as a sports broadcaster for the local television station. In Omaha, Fritz Johnson was a minor celebrity. People recognized him on the street. They'd wave and say, "Hey, Fritz, how are you doing?" He had built a full, successful, and happy life from scratch. But as soon as the news broke that he was actually Larry Bader, that carefully constructed life came crashing down around him. The television station he worked for fired him immediately. His second wife, the woman in Omaha, left him. It turned out their marriage had never been legally valid in the first place because Larry Bader was still legally married to his first wife, Mary Lou. And to make matters worse, the insurance company that had paid out the life insurance policy to Mary Lou all those years ago now demanded that the money be repaid in full. Throughout this entire chaotic ordeal, as his world fell apart, Fritz continued to insist that he was not Larry Bader. He was convinced it was all a huge, unexplainable mistake. He simply could not comprehend how any of this could have happened. It made no sense to him. Eventually, a team of experts, including doctors and psychologists, was brought in to examine him. They put him through nearly 2 weeks of intensive tests and evaluations. At the end of it all, they came to 2 firm conclusions. First, there was no doubt whatsoever that he was, in fact, Larry Bader. The physical evidence was undeniable. And second, He was almost certainly suffering from an extreme and profound case of amnesia, a total loss of his previous identity and memories. But how he had developed this amnesia, the doctors had no idea. And of course, Fritz had no idea either. It's unlikely we will ever get any more answers about what truly happened to Larry Bader on that stormy day on Lake Erie. Because just 1 year after his old identity was discovered, Fritz Johnson, or Larry Bader, passed away. He had been suffering from cancer in one of his eyes, which was why he wore the eye patch. The cancer returned, and this time it took his life. He died without ever recovering a single memory of his life as Larry Bader. Today, his case is still considered one of the most baffling and believable cases of profound amnesia ever recorded. He was a man who lived 2 completely separate lives, and he died only remembering one of them. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia, there's a thick green jungle that stretches for miles. If you know where to look, you can find a narrow walking path that winds its way from the edge of the town deep into the wilderness. If you follow that path far enough, it will eventually lead you to a truly incredible sight, an enormous old railroad bridge that spans a huge deep ravine. The bridge is no longer used for trains. It was decommissioned many years ago. But ironically, since the trains stopped running, the bridge has seen more traffic than ever. It's just a different kind of traffic now. People come from all over to visit this bridge for one specific, heart-pounding reason: to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people leap from high places, like this very bridge, with a long, elastic rope tied to their ankles. The length of that rope is carefully calculated so that when it stretches to its absolute limit, the jumper will stop just short of hitting the ground below. It's an adrenaline rush unlike any other. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez was living in the city of Medellin, about an hour north of Amaga. She turned to her boyfriend and told him she was finally ready to do it. She wanted to go bungee jumping. This was a conversation they had had many times before. Yesenia had always been fascinated by the idea of it, but every time they made actual plans to go, her fear would get the better of her and she would back out at the last minute. But this time was different. For whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia felt she had the courage to finally see it through. Her boyfriend, hearing the seriousness in her voice, seized the opportunity. He had never been bungee jumping either and was eager to try it, but he wouldn't go without her. Now that she seemed genuinely committed, he immediately got on the phone and called the Amaga Bungee Jumping Company. He booked a spot for both of them to jump from the famous railroad bridge. On the day of their jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend got in their car and made the hour-long drive south to Amaga. They found the walking trail and began the trek through the jungle out to the bridge. When they finally emerged from the trees and stepped onto the structure, they were stunned. They knew it was a popular spot, but they had not expected to see so many people. A long line of jumpers, nearly 100 of them, was already snaking its way across the bridge, all waiting for their turn to take the leap. Yesenia and her boyfriend found the end of the line and began their wait. Over the next several hours, they had a front row seat to the spectacle. One by one, they watched the people ahead of them get harnessed up, walk to the edge, and plummet into the ravine below, their screams of terror quickly turning into shouts of joy. In her mind, Yesenia had pictured arriving at the bridge, quickly getting it over with, and then celebrating their bravery. But this long, drawn-out wait was having the opposite effect. With every person who jumped, her own anxiety grew. Suddenly, bungee jumping didn't look fun at all. It looked terrifying. She started to second-guess her decision all over again. Her boyfriend could see the panic rising in her eyes. He tried to calm her down, pointing out how safe it was. He told her to look at all the people who had already jumped. They were all perfectly fine, all smiling and laughing. He told her how proud she would be of herself once it was over. But despite his best efforts, Yesenia couldn't shake the fear. Still, she told him she wasn't going to back down. She was determined to go through with it. Several more high-stress hours passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line. A staff member who had been running the jumps all day long signaled for them to step forward onto the launch platform. They walked to the very edge, looking down into the vast empty space of the ravine. The staff began fitting them with their harnesses and safety gear. The whole time, Yesenia's panic was escalating. Her heart was hammering in her chest. Her vision started to narrow. This didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It just felt like something she had to survive. She just wanted it to be over. As the staff members were making their final checks, one of them looked at her boyfriend, whose gear was fully connected, and gave the signal. He said, "Okay, jump." Yesenia heard the command. In her panicked state, in the blur of fear and adrenaline, she thought he was talking to her. And so, without a moment's hesitation, Yesenia jumped. But she had made a terrible mistake. The staff member had been talking to her boyfriend, not to her. The staff had only finished putting her harness on. They had not yet attached the actual elastic bungee rope to her ankles. When Yesenia leaped from the platform, there was nothing to stop her fall. Her boyfriend watched in horror. He ripped off his own gear and sprinted down the bridge, leaping over the railing and scrambling down the steep, rocky hillside into the ravine. But by the time he reached his girlfriend at the bottom, it was too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined that Yesenia did not die from the impact with the ground. The autopsy revealed that she had actually died from a massive heart attack that she suffered during the fall. This means she must have realized in those few terrifying seconds after she jumped that she had made a mistake. She knew the bungee cord wasn't attached. And the sheer overwhelming fear of what was about to happen is what literally killed her before she ever reached the bottom. In early 1974, in the small town of Ossett in central England, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living a happy life. He had a wife named Christine and 5 children, and he was known throughout their neighborhood as a great father and a wonderful husband with a fantastic sense of humor. Neighbors would often say that when you walked past the Taylor house, you could almost always hear the sound of Michael laughing or telling jokes to his family. Their home was a place filled with joy. But in April of that year, everything changed. Michael was doing some repairs around the house when he fell from a ladder and injured his back. The injury itself wasn't severe, but it left him with chronic, nagging pain. And that constant pain began to change him. The cheerful, funny, happy-go-lucky Michael Taylor slowly disappeared. In his place was a man who was sad, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. He became so irritable that his own family found it difficult to be around him. He would lash out at them over the smallest things. The laughter in the Taylor home was replaced with a tense silence. The Taylors were not a particularly religious family, but in a small town like Ossett at that time, most of their friends and neighbors were. When one of Michael's friends learned about how much he was struggling, he approached Michael with a suggestion. He told him that he should really consider turning to religion for help and guidance. Specifically, he recommended a local Christian group called the Christian Fellowship Group. It wasn't a formal church, but rather a small, dedicated prayer group for people who wanted a deeper level of spiritual support. But the real draw of this group, the friend explained, was its leader. Her name was Marie Robinson. She was only 21 years old, but she was incredibly charismatic, energetic, and friendly. She had a special way of making everyone in her group feel welcome and important. Michael's friend was convinced that Marie could be the one to help him, that she could help him find his way back to being his old self. Michael was at rock bottom. He was desperate and felt like he had nothing to lose. So he agreed to give it a try. On the 12th of September, 1974, Michael went to the church where the fellowship group held its meetings. He walked inside and found his way to a back room. When he entered, he saw about 20 people sitting in a circle of chairs. As soon as they noticed him, they all stood up and greeted him with open arms, welcoming him and inviting him to sit with them. Then, the woman who had to be Marie stood up. She had a huge, warm smile on her face. She looked directly at Michael and encouraged him to come and take the empty seat right next to her. For the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile spread across Michael's face. He walked across the room and sat down beside Marie. As she began to lead the group in prayer, Michael noticed something incredible. For that brief period of time, he didn't feel his chronic back pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael returned home, the pain and the depression came flooding back. It was as if the only place he could find relief was inside that church with that group. And so, Michael became completely devoted to it. He attended every single meeting. Over the next couple of weeks, he grew very close to Marie, and it seemed that Marie was growing very close to him as well. They started staying behind after the meetings were over, just the two of them, spending time together in what they called quiet prayer. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing, but their bond was obvious. It wasn't long before other members of the group began to suspect that they were having an affair. In a small town like Osset, rumors travel fast. The whispers from inside the church soon spread throughout the town. And before long, Michael's wife, Christine, started hearing them from her friends and neighbors. She was told that her husband was cheating on her with the young leader of his new prayer group. Christine had already had her own suspicion. Marie was the only thing Michael ever talked about anymore. On October 1st, just a few weeks after Michael first joined the group, Christine decided she had to know the truth. She waited until Michael left the house to head to his evening meeting. Then she got in her car and followed him to the church. She parked across the street, took a deep breath to steady her nerves, and then she got out and marched towards the front doors. She stormed inside, found the room where the meeting was being held, and burst through the door. She pointed directly at her husband, who was sitting with his back to her, and she yelled, "I know you're having an affair with Marie." You're going to admit it, right here, in front of this whole group. Michael stood up from his chair. But instead of turning to face his wife, instead of addressing her accusation, he turned and stared across the room at Marie. And when Marie made eye contact with him, she let out a blood-curdling scream. She would later say that in that moment, Michael didn't look human. He looked, in her words, like a beast. His eyes were wild. As Michael stood there, locked in this intense, aggressive stare with Marie, he suddenly began speaking in tongues. It's a phenomenon where a person utters words or sounds that resemble a language, but it's unintelligible to the speaker. The belief is that some other entity is speaking through them. Michael was barking these strange words and sounds at Marie. Everyone else in the room was frozen in shock. It had all happened so fast. Christine's sudden accusation, Michael's bizarre and terrifying reaction. Before anyone could do anything, Michael went from just speaking in tongues to lunging across the room as if he was going to physically attack Marie. Instantly, the other members of the group sprang into action. They jumped on top of Michael, trying to hold him down. But even with 10 or 15 people piling on top of him, he fought with an incredible strength, screaming and snarling, still trying to get to Marie. And then, something even stranger happened. Marie herself suddenly broke out into tongues. And as soon as she did, Michael stopped struggling so violently. He stayed on the floor, pinned down, and just continued to speak in tongues back at her. The two of them were looking at each other, having this strange, otherworldly conversation, while the rest of the group, completely dumbfounded, could only pray. After about an hour of this, Michael suddenly went limp. He collapsed as if he had lost consciousness. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Michael's still form on the floor. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around frantically as if he was waking up in a strange place with no idea how he had gotten there. Michael would claim he had absolutely no memory of the events that had just transpired. At this point, Marie turned to him and Christine. She told them that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force. And the only way to help him, she said, was to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is a religious ritual aimed at expelling a supposedly evil spirit from a person or a place. Michael and Christine were completely at a loss. They were both in a state of shock for very different reasons, and they had no idea what to do. They simply deferred to Marie's judgment. They agreed that an exorcism seemed like the only way forward. So they left the church and went home. The next morning, Marie contacted the Anglican Church of England and formally requested an exorcism for Michael Taylor. After hearing the details of what had happened, the church agreed. They said it did indeed sound like a case that required an exorcism. The following day, they sent two of their most experienced exorcists, a man named Peter and another named Raymond, to Ossett. Peter and Raymond went to the Taylor home and observed Michael. It didn't take them long to reach the same conclusion. They too believed that Michael was possessed by at least one demonic entity. They told Michael that an exorcism was the only solution, but they needed his full consent to proceed. Michael agreed. Christine, still completely overwhelmed and just going along with whatever the experts said, agreed as well. A day later, on the night of October 4th, everyone gathered at another church in a neighboring town. It was 10 p.m. Michael, Christine, the two exorcists, and all the members of the Christian fellowship group were there. Michael was seated in a chair in the middle of the room. As soon as Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying, Michael erupted. He started screaming in tongues and writhing in his chair. He fell to the floor and began contorting his body into grotesque and unnatural positions, as if the words of the prayers were causing him physical agony. The exorcism went on for 8 straight hours. At one point, they had to physically tie Michael down to prevent him from harming himself or anyone else in the room. Finally, after 8 grueling hours, they stopped. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. Michael looked completely drained. As soon as the ritual paused, he collapsed on the ground unconscious. When he eventually came to, he was still tied down, and he looked around wildly, again with no memory of what had just happened. Peter and Raymond told him that the exorcism had been mostly successful. They claimed they had identified 40 different demons inside of him and that the ritual had managed to expel 37 of them. But, they warned, there were still 3 demons left inside. They were all too tired to continue right now. They told Michael to go home, get some rest, and they would return the next day to finish the job and cast out the final 3 demons. And so, Michael and Christine left the church and headed home. A few hours later, around noon the next day, a woman who lived near the Taylors heard a strange noise outside her house. It sounded like someone yelling. She went to her front window and pulled back the curtain to look outside. What she saw made her gasp. Walking down the middle of the street was Michael Taylor. He was completely naked and covered from head to toe in blood. He was rambling incoherently about Satan. The woman immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they found Michael curled up in the fetal position on the sidewalk outside the woman's house. He was giggling to himself like a small child. The police cautiously approached him. At some point, Michael seemed to snap out of his state and looked up at the officers as if he had no idea what was going on. They eventually got him to tell them his name and where he lived. After calling for backup to handle Michael, the first responding officers made their way to the Taylor residence. They went inside. And the moment they saw the scene, one of the officers turned around, ran back outside, and began to vomit on the lawn. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous and gruesome crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and Christine had returned from the exorcism, Michael had fallen into another one of his trances. he had brutally attacked his wife, beating her until she fell to the ground. Then, as she was dying, Michael had jumped on top of her and, using only his bare hands, had ripped her face off and thrown it across the room. As she bled to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his own body. After she was dead, he found the family dog and killed it as well. Fortunately, their 5 children had not been home at the time of the horrific attack, and they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, both the prosecution and the defense pointed the finger at the Anglican Church and at Marie Robinson's religious group. They argued that by performing the exorcism, they had effectively convinced Michael that he was possessed by demons, which in turn caused him to have a psychotic break and act out with such extreme violence. Ultimately, Michael Taylor was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent only 4 years in psychiatric care before he was released. Today, he is reportedly still living as a free man in Ossett. But despite the legal outcome, there are many people, both religious and non-religious, who believe the case of Michael Taylor is one of the few genuine and terrifying cases of demonic possession in modern history. And as for whether Michael and Marie were actually having an affair, it was never definitively proven, but it has always been widely assumed that they were. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Early on the evening of Sunday, the 27th of November, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods was leaning towards the mirror in her small New York City apartment. She was carefully applying her eyeliner, her hands steady, a skill she'd perfected over countless nights just like this one. Her phone, sitting on the bathroom counter next to her makeup, buzzed. She heard it, but she didn't even glance over to see who was calling. She just didn't have the time. Her shift started at 7, and she couldn't afford to be late. Catherine had moved to the city from Ohio 3 years earlier. She had that big, bright dream that pulls so many people to New York. She wanted to be a dancer on Broadway. She imagined her name in lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of being on stage under the hot theatrical lights. But New York City is an expensive place to have a dream. Just existing here costs a fortune. So, in between chasing that Broadway dream, she was working. A lot. She actually had 3 different jobs just to keep her head above water, to pay the rent, and to afford the lessons she needed to even have a shot at her dream. 2 of her jobs were pretty normal. She was a waitress at a busy diner, where she was quick on her feet and had a friendly smile that earned her good tips. She also taught dance classes to little kids, their energy and enthusiasm a welcome contrast to the cynicism of the city. She loved seeing their faces light up when they nailed a new step. But tonight, she was getting ready for her 3rd job. And this job was different. It wasn't something she talked about. In fact, she was deeply embarrassed by it, and she kept it a secret from almost everyone she knew, especially her family back in Ohio. Her 3rd job was at a place near Times Square called Flash Dancers. She was a topless dancer. Catherine really, truly hated the work. The leering eyes, the fake smiles she had to put on, the way it made her feel. But the money was good. It was really good. And that money was the fuel for her dream. It paid for the expensive voice lessons and the advanced dance classes that were essential if she was ever going to make it to Broadway. She lived in Manhattan, the most expensive borough in an already incredibly expensive city. She knew she could save a lot of money if she moved to a cheaper neighborhood in a different borough like Queens or Brooklyn. And when she had first arrived in New York, that's exactly what she'd done. She'd found a small place in a less expensive area, thinking she was being smart and practical. But that practicality had come at a terrifying cost. Her landlord there had sexually assaulted her. The experience was so traumatic, so violating, that it nearly broke her. For a while, she seriously considered just giving up, packing her bags, and moving back home to Ohio, leaving the city and her dream behind forever. It felt like the city itself had chewed her up and spit her out. But in the end, after a lot of soul-searching, she decided to stay. She was a fighter. She wasn't going to let one horrible man destroy everything she had worked for. But she did make a change. She moved. She found her current apartment in a much safer part of Manhattan, where she felt she could walk down the street at night without constantly looking over her shoulder. To help with the much higher rent, she got a roommate. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was a familiar face from back home in Ohio, a little piece of her old life in this new, overwhelming city. At this very moment, as Catherine was finishing her makeup, David wasn't in the apartment. He'd gone downstairs a few minutes ago to get his car, which was parked a few blocks away. He was going to drive her to her shift at the club. Catherine finished with her eyeliner, satisfied with the clean, sharp line. She left the bathroom and walked through the small living room. On the floor, a black dog was sleeping soundly. She had to step carefully over it. The dog wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter. It was one of the many side jobs he juggled to make ends meet, just like her. This particular dog was just staying with them for a few days while its owners were out of town. When David wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a fancy hotel just up the street from their apartment building. Catherine and David had a history that was a bit complicated. They had actually been a couple at one point. They dated for a little while after he followed her to New York. But these days, they were just friends, just roommates, splitting the bills to survive in the city. Although, if Catherine was being honest with herself, she sometimes wondered if they should give it another shot. Just a few days ago had been Thanksgiving. Instead of making the long trip back to Ohio like she usually did, she had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. Just the two of them. And it had been really nice. It felt comfortable, easy, like coming home. A big part of what she appreciated about him was that he knew about her job at Flash Dancers. He was one of the very few people who did, and he didn't judge her for it. He understood why she was doing it, and that lack of judgment was a rare and precious thing. But there was one major hurdle she could see if they were to ever get back together. It was David's attitude towards other men in her life. He seemed to dislike basically every single man she ever met or dated. It didn't matter who they were. He just had this immediate, almost instinctual distrust of them. Now, with some of the guys, she could kind of see his point. There was a guy named Joe she had dated for a short time. She had met him at the strip club. He was a customer. David had been very clear that he thought Joe was bad news. And in hindsight, he was probably right. But then there were other guys, like Paul. Paul was a personal trainer at her gym. She'd gone on a few dates with him, but it was nothing serious. They were more like friends who spoke on the phone every now and then. Paul had always been perfectly nice to David, polite and friendly whenever he saw him. But David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just had a bad feeling about him. For now, though, Catherine pushed those thoughts aside. She didn't have time to sort out her entire romantic life. She just needed to get dressed and get downstairs before David started wondering where she was. She went into her bedroom, and that's when she heard it. The dog in the living room suddenly started barking. It wasn't a playful bark. It was sharp, insistent, like it was barking at something or someone. Curious, Catherine walked out of her bedroom to see what was going on. A little while later, David Hahn was walking quickly along the sidewalk, his breath misting in the cool November air. He was heading to his car, parked several blocks away from the apartment. He was already feeling a bit rushed. He finally reached the car, jumped in, and started the engine. He drove back towards his building, navigating the busy Sunday evening traffic. As he pulled up to the curb in front of his apartment, he took out his phone and called Catherine. He expected her to answer right away, to say she was on her way down. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was odd. He tried again. Voicemail again? He sighed, a little annoyed, and put his hazard lights on. He got out of the car and headed into the building to go get her. He took the stairs 2 at a time up to the second floor. As he turned down the hallway towards his apartment, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, standing right in the middle of the shared hallway, was the black dog he was supposed to be dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment. David just stared for a second, totally confused. Then he realized there was someone else there. His neighbor, a man named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. Brad was holding a leash, and it was clipped onto the dog's collar. Brad looked a bit surprised to see David, and David was just trying to process what was happening. Why did his neighbor have the dog on a leash in the hallway? Brad spoke first. He explained that he'd been coming up the stairs and had found the dog just wandering around by itself. He said he recognized it as David's dog, so he'd brought it back to their door. Brad said he had just knocked, but nobody had answered. At this point, David understood why Brad had the dog, but the bigger question was still unanswered. How did the dog get out in the first place? He didn't ask, though. He just thanked Brad, took the leash, and stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The door was closed, but when he tried the handle, he found that it was unlocked. He couldn't remember if he'd left it unlocked when he went to get the car. It wasn't something he would normally do. He pushed the door open and called out Catherine's name. There was no answer. Just silence. And that was really weird. She should have been right there, waiting for him. He stepped inside, the dog trailing behind him. He didn't see Catherine in the living room, but he did see that the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. He walked over to it and called her name again. Catherine? We're going to be late. Still nothing. He pushed on her door, expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. It moved maybe a few inches and then stopped hard. He could feel resistance from the other side, like something heavy was on the floor blocking the door from opening. And now, with all these strange little things piling up the dog in the hall, the unlocked door, the silence, the blocked bedroom door, a feeling of serious worry started to wash over him. A surge of adrenaline hit him, and he put his shoulder into the door and shoved it hard. It flew open. He stuck his head inside to see what was blocking it, and when his eyes adjusted to the light, what he saw made him recoil instantly. He pulled back, stumbled out of the room, ran back into the hallway, fumbling for his phone, and called the police. About a half an hour later, around 7:30 in the evening, an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up the stairs of an apartment building in a nice part of Manhattan. This area was known for being extremely safe. Murders just didn't really happen here. But if the 911 call he'd just heard was accurate, he knew a potentially grisly murder scene was waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he got to the second-floor landing, he saw that a few other uniformed NYPD officers were already on the scene. One of them was talking to a young, skinny guy who was standing in the hallway looking completely distraught. The young man was holding a leash, and at the end of it was a black dog that was sitting quietly at his feet. Another officer saw Getz arrive and walked over to brief him. He said the man being interviewed was the victim's roommate, David Hahn. He was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment, in the back bedroom. Getz nodded, his face grim, and walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the open door of the apartment. His plan was always the same. He wanted to see the scene for himself before he started questioning anyone. Getz pulled on a pair of disposable rubber gloves and began his initial assessment. He carefully examined the doorframe of the apartment and then the door itself. He was looking for any signs of a break-in, any splintered wood or scratch marks around the lock. He saw nothing. No damage at all. That told him something important right away. Whoever did this either had a key or was let inside. He stepped into the apartment. The small living room was a little bit messy, but it was a lived-in messy, not a violent messy. The futon was pulled out into a bed, and there were some men's clothes strewn about. It just looked like a typical New York City apartment shared by young people. Getz moved slowly through the living room, taking care not to disturb anything. He headed towards the back of the apartment, towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was located. The door to the room was open just wide enough for him to slip through. When he stepped inside, the scene changed dramatically. There was blood everywhere. It was spattered on the walls, on the furniture. The room itself looked like a tornado had gone through it. It had been completely torn apart. A dresser drawer was hanging open, and women's clothing was scattered all over the floor. The mattress had been ripped completely off the bed frame and was now lying crookedly on the floor. That's what had been blocking the door from opening. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, in a large pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. On the front of her t-shirt, he saw a very clear, distinct shoe print. It looked as if her killer had literally stepped on her chest during or after the attack. There were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. He also saw what he immediately recognized as defensive wounds on her hands and her forearms, little cuts and slices that told him she had fought back hard against her attacker. She had fought for her life. But the worst of her injuries were to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat with such savage force that they had nearly decapitated her. To Detective Getz, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was an attack fueled by an absolute, uncontrollable rage. At that moment, Getz heard footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. The blocked door was making it difficult for people to move in and out of the bedroom, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to carefully pick up the mattress from the floor. They leaned it up against the wall, out of the way, so the bedroom door could now swing open freely. With the team now able to access the room properly, Detective Getz stepped back and let them do their work. He watched as they meticulously documented everything. He saw them carefully lift the shoe print from the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. Then they found a second, identical shoe print on her bedsheets, and they collected that one as well. To Getz, both of these prints looked like they came from the exact same shoe. And just by looking at them, he could tell they were made by a man's shoe, probably an average size. This immediately made Detective Getz curious about something. He stepped out of the bedroom and back into the living room. He quickly found a couple of pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor near the futon. He picked one up and looked at the sole. While the tread pattern didn't match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, the size looked about right. They appeared to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 that night, Detective Getz sat down at a metal table inside an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. He slid a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim. And, at that moment, Detective Getz's number one suspect. The facts were simple and damning. There was no sign of forced entry at the apartment, which meant Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was led inside by someone who did. The murder weapon was a knife, and the sheer brutality of the attack screamed personal motivation. It felt like a crime of passion. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been completely trashed, nothing of value seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, a sexual motive was also a strong possibility. So Getz's working theory was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well, had easy access to her home, and possibly had a romantic or sexual connection to her. David Hahn fit that profile perfectly. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and took out his notepad, he did a quick, subtle scan of David's hands and forearms. He saw no visible cuts, no scrapes, no bruises. That was a little strange. Getz figured that a fight as violent as the one Catherine had put up would have almost certainly left a mark on her attacker. But he didn't mention this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward, his expression sympathetic, and asked David to walk him through everything that had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a little as he reached for the water bottle. He took a deep breath to try and calm his nerves. He said he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40. That's when he left to go get his car so he could drive her to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But, he said, getting his car had taken longer than he expected. On the way, he had run into a couple of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them for a few minutes. He said that after he finally got his car and drove back to the apartment, He had expected Catherine to be waiting for him out on the curb. But when he got there, she was nowhere in sight. She didn't answer her phone when he called, so he'd gone inside and run upstairs. In the hallway, he said, he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was for some reason holding the leash of the dog David was supposed to be watching. Then David said he went into the apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. He said he called 911 immediately and that it was right around 7 o'clock. As David said this, Getz stopped writing on his notepad and just looked up at him. He could not believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he was only out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and in that tiny window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered, and her killer had managed to escape without anyone seeing them. It was, honestly, one of the weakest alibis Getz had ever heard in his career. But he didn't let his skepticism show. He didn't want David to know just how close he was to being arrested, because he didn't want David to shut down and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very calm and understanding as he asked how long David had known Catherine. David explained that they had met a few years ago back in Ohio while Catherine was home visiting family. They started dating, and he eventually decided to move to New York to be with her. But not long after he arrived, Catherine broke up with him, and she had asked him to move out of the apartment. David said he hadn't been able to afford a place of his own, so he had started sleeping in his car. He said Catherine had felt bad about that, and so she had eventually let him move back in, but on one condition, that he slept on the futon in the living room and that they were just roommates. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page. This new information was a bombshell. David wasn't just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. A spurned ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see her alive and the first person to find her body. Getz was now more confident than ever that he was sitting across the table from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but he said he needed to go check on something really quick. David agreed to wait. As Getz stood up to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back. He asked David one last, seemingly casual question. He asked him what his shoe size was. Without a moment's hesitation, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down on his notepad, and then he left the room. What he didn't tell David was that the reason he was stepping out was to get some crucial updates from the forensics team and from the uniformed officers who were, at that very moment, questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to come back and use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, around 3 in the afternoon the next day, Detective Getz was sitting at his desk, feeling completely exhausted. He was pounding yet another cup of bitter office coffee. He had been up all night long interrogating David, who was still, at that very moment, sitting in an interrogation room just down the hall. Getz had also been going back and forth with his team, getting updates from forensics and from officers out in the field, and he still had a mountain of paperwork to get through before he could even think about going home to sleep. Right now, he was going over a new batch of reports from the officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking all the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And just as Getz had suspected, the information they were getting was starting to poke holes in David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 and that at that time, Catherine was perfectly fine. But 2 different neighbors reported hearing screams coming from that apartment well before 6:40. The man who lived in the unit directly above them said he had heard 3 distinct screams at exactly 6:28. And the people who lived in the apartment right next door to them said they'd heard screaming, a dog barking, and the sound of furniture being moved around even earlier, sometime between 5:45 and 6 o'clock. Now, none of these neighbors had called the police or done anything about the noises because the sounds had stopped pretty quickly. In a crowded New York City apartment building, strange noises were a part of life. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had found the dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had insisted that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 o'clock, a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew from experience that witnesses were often unreliable when it came to specific times. And in a dense building, it was easy to get noises from different apartments confused. But still, all of these inconsistencies were adding up. It was looking more and more like David's alibi had serious problems. The detective sat back in his chair, took another sip of coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up. It was the forensics team, and they had an update on those shoe prints from the crime scene. They had confirmed that the prints on Catherine's t-shirt and on the bedsheets were indeed left by a man's shoe. They were a men's size, 10.5. This was the exact size David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room for another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer him a bottle of water. He just sat down, looked David straight in the eye, and confronted him with all the new evidence. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his size. He told him that his neighbors had heard screams coming from his apartment long before he claimed to have left the building. And he told him that Brad Stewart said he'd seen him in the hallway at least half an hour earlier than David had claimed. Getz then leaned in close and played his trump card. He told David that there were security cameras in the apartment building and that his officers were in the process of getting the footage right now. So, if David had anything to confess, he had better do it now, before the cameras proved he was lying. Getz watched as David's expression shifted from exhaustion to pure, raw fear. It seemed like this was the first time that David was truly realizing that the police did not believe his story for a second. After a moment of stunned silence, David insisted, his voice cracking, that he had not killed Catherine. He begged Getz to believe him. But when the detective just glared back at him, his face a mask of stone, David launched into a brand new story. It was a story he had not mentioned at all in the nearly 20 hours he had been interrogated. David said that Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. He said she had dated him for a while, but that David had always thought he was a creep. David said Catherine had even told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said, the police really needed to go investigate Paul, not him. To Detective Getz, this sounded like a desperate, last-ditch effort from a guilty man trying to cast suspicion on someone, anyone else. But he also knew that he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So he wrote down Paul's name and told David they would look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room. And outside on the steps of the precinct, reporters from all the major newspapers were beginning to gather their cameras at the ready. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder was everywhere. Pictures of her smiling face were on the front page of every paper in the city. The headline on the New York Daily News made Detective Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." The article inside reported that Catherine's family back in Ohio hadn't even known she was working as a topless dancer until they flew to New York to identify her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers were determined to run with that angle. A media circus was the last thing he needed. His team was already under immense pressure to make an arrest, and now they were going to be flooded with tips from the public, most of which would be useless. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to an interrogation room. He had ended the day yesterday feeling pretty sure that David was his killer. He had finally sent David home, but with strict instructions not to leave the city. He fully intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, he had to do his due diligence. He had to follow up on the other leads he had, if only to definitively rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now, waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man David had named. Officers had tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The man who was supposedly obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was subtly look down at Paul's shoes. He could see they were a pretty typical size, maybe a 10 or an 11. At a glance, they could easily be a 10.5. Getz also looked for any scratches or bruises on Paul's hands and arms. And he did see one small injury, a little cut on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked him about it. Paul explained calmly that his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym where he worked as a trainer. Paul was very calm, very soft-spoken. He said he had heard about Catherine's death in the news, and he was devastated. He just wanted to help the investigation in any way he could. When Getz told him that they had gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes. He said that David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had been dating on and off ever since. He said that at the time of Catherine's death, they were in an off phase, but he still cared about her deeply and had hoped that one day they might get back together for good. Paul told Getz that he hadn't seen Catherine in person on the day she died, but he had spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon. He said this wasn't unusual. They still talked on the phone from time to time, even when they weren't officially together. Paul said he had actually tried to call her a second time later that day, but she didn't answer. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Then Paul laid out his alibi for that night. He said he had gone shopping with some friends, and then later he went to a local bar to watch the Jets game, which started around 8:30. Getz made a note to check Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might want to kill Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes seemed to light up, as if he'd just remembered something important. He said there was this other guy, a kind of stalker named Joe. He had been one of Catherine's regular customers at the strip club. He said that months ago, this guy Joe had somehow gotten Catherine's personal phone number and had started contacting her outside of the club. Paul said that around that same time, Catherine had been drugged at work. Someone had slipped a roofie, the date rape drug, into her drink during one of her shifts. Paul said that even though he could never prove it, he had always suspected that it was Joe who had drugged her. He said Catherine had eventually cut off all contact with Joe, but the whole incident had really bothered Paul. It bothered him so much that he had tried to convince Catherine to quit her job at the club, but she had refused. Paul even admitted that he had gone so far as to call Catherine's father in Ohio to tell him how worried he was about her. He said Catherine had been furious with him for doing that and had stopped talking to him for weeks. Getz jotted all of this down. Then he asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but he was sure it was in Catherine's phone. Because he said the very last time he spoke to Catherine on the phone, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that had really surprised him. She said that after months and months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. At this, Getz studied Paul's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. This whole story about Joe could just be a clever way for Paul to deflect suspicion from himself. But Paul seemed sincere. It didn't feel like he was making it up. And besides, it would be simple enough to verify his story by checking Catherine's phone records. Detective Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of the customers from Catherine's secret life at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling deeply annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been another call from another reporter demanding an update on the case. But Getz had no updates to give. He hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. For now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he had subpoenaed the day before. And they showed that Paul Cortez had been telling the truth. The records confirmed that both Paul and a man named Joe had called Catherine shortly before she was killed. So, Getz had his officers track down Joe and bring him in for an interview. He asked Joe to explain why, after months of no contact, he had suddenly decided to call Catherine on the very day she was murdered. Joe claimed he was just calling to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He insisted he was just trying to be friendly. But then, Getz asked Joe point blank if he had ever put a roofie in anyone's drink. At this question, Joe's eyes went wide. He started to stammer and sputter, and he swore that he would never, ever dream of doing something like that. But based on Joe's panicked reaction, Getz had a strong feeling that he was lying. And so now, the entire investigation felt like it was wide open again. Just a few days ago, Getz had been absolutely certain that David Hahn was the killer. But now, all these other men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually starting to look more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers from the hotel, and they confirmed his story. They said he really had stopped to talk with them on the street on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would definitively prove David was lying about his timeline, it actually did the opposite. The footage showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38, which lined up perfectly with his story that he left around 6:40. Now, this didn't completely exonerate him. Based on what the neighbors had heard, Catherine could have been killed before he left. But there weren't many cameras in the old building, and there was no camera covering the second-floor hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another who, if anyone, had gone into that apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang again. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter. But this time, he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and he could hear the excitement in their voice. They told Getz that they had just discovered something big, something they had completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics tech explained that when they had first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was blocking the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they had done that, the mattress had accidentally covered up a crucial piece of evidence that was on the wall the whole time. It was a bloody handprint. It wasn't until a couple of days later, after they had carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they finally moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they saw it. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news. This was the break he had been waiting for. Now he thought all he had to do was go get handprints from all 3 of his suspects and see which one matched. It seemed like it would be that simple. But he quickly realized he had a major problem. By this point, some of his suspects had already gotten lawyers. And their lawyers were advising them not to speak with the police anymore, let alone voluntarily hand over their handprints. And Getz couldn't legally force them to give their prints unless he arrested them first. And so, Detective Getz found himself in a frustrating catch, 2-2. He needed the suspect's handprint in order to make an arrest, but he couldn't get the handprint unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation stalled. Weeks went by. Detective Getz grew more and more frustrated because there was nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. Meanwhile, the case was still getting a ton of coverage in the press. And to the public, it looked like the NYPD was just dropping the ball. But then, on December 16th, 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the very news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of a New York newspaper. And what this woman told them led Detective Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on all the forensic evidence and the numerous interviews police conducted, this is what they believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of the 27th of November, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 in the evening, the killer climbed the stairs inside Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she would be alone in the apartment, getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. The fact that she worked there, that she had this secret life, bothered the killer more than they ever let on. The thought of Catherine dancing for other men, giving her attention to other men, filled the killer with a jealous rage they could barely contain. The killer had tried to win her over, had tried to talk her into being with them exclusively, but she had rejected him. So, in the killer's mind, the time for talking was over. And so, the killer walked quietly up to the door of apartment 2D. They reached down and turned the handle. It was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer pulled out the knife that they had hidden inside their sweatshirt. But then, something they had not planned for happened. The black dog that was lying on the apartment floor jumped up and began to bark at them. For a split second, the killer thought about just turning around and leaving, abandoning the plan. But then, Catherine, alerted by the dog's barking, came out of her bedroom. She looked right at the killer, and she saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and turned and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off-limits to the killer in the past. And just the thought of that, of her trying to keep him out of her space, sent a surge of pure anger through them. The killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, trying to lift up the heavy mattress to use it as a shield. But the killer was too strong and too fast. They forced their way past the mattress and grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine was a fighter. She fought back with everything she had. She began thrashing and kicking, scratching and biting, doing anything she could to break free. But she couldn't. They struggled wildly around the small room, smashing into furniture, knocking things over. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up the knife they had brought and slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with that fatal wound, Catherine kept fighting. She fought with such viciousness that the killer actually had to brace themselves against the wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos of that struggle, the killer didn't even realize that as they steadied themselves, they had placed their bloody hand flat against the wall, leaving a perfect print behind. Finally, Catherine fell to the floor. But the killer was still blinded by rage. They got down on the floor with her and began stabbing her over and over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that the black dog that had barked at them had gotten out of the apartment during the chaos. Now, the killer wanted the dog to be back inside the apartment, but the dog was on edge, still barking at them. So instead, the killer just pulled the apartment door shut, trapping the dog out in the hallway. And then the killer fled the building, using a back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught. Until their violent past finally came back to haunt them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who had no connection to Catherine at all was walking down a street in New York City when she glanced over at a newsstand. And on the cover of one of the newspapers, a picture was plastered across the front page. It was a picture of a man who was currently a person of interest in a high-profile murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this man, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had been too scared and ashamed to ever file a police report. But now, seeing his face in the paper, seeing that this horrible person was being investigated for murder, she knew she had to speak up. She called the NYPD and she told them everything she knew. The NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's brave testimony as the basis to arrest the killer for the previous assault. And finally, once he was under arrest, Detective Getz was legally able to get his handprint. And those prints were a perfect match to the bloody handprint found on Catherine's bedroom wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions about Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep, a violent predator who had assaulted at least one other woman before he murdered Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell phone towers would later prove that Paul was in the immediate vicinity of Catherine's apartment building right before her murder. The records also showed he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited. He watched until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car. And then he hustled upstairs, knowing that Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for about 20 minutes, it was more than enough time for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine in a jealous rage, and slip away completely unnoticed. Paul Cortez was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, the 23rd of December, 2005. He was later found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And just like that, the truth finally came to light. But the haunting question remains, how many stories like this are still unresolved, hidden from view? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're not ready to stop here, there's still so much waiting for you in the next episode. See you next time. A chilly and rainy evening in late January of 1965 marks the beginning of the story. In the Lebanonian village of Antelias, which is located just a short distance to the north of Beirut, we are situated on a stretch of shoreline. Furthermore, for a young police officer by the name of Fareed Jabber, this evening was about to bring about a sea change in his life. Everything about the weather was terrible. The sand on the beach was transformed into a chilly, dark slush as a result of the continuous and freezing rain that was blowing down. In addition to the deep darkness that was pressing in from all directions, the wind howled in from the sea. The kind of night that would have been ideal for sensible people to be at home, tucked away in their cozy beds. Furthermore, Fareed fervently wanted that he was one of its members. While he was out here, strolling along the beach with his companion, he had his jacket drawn over him, but it wasn't doing anything to help him. The chilly air had already penetrated his bones to a great extent. However, Fareed was in need of this employment. For someone who lived in a small town like Antelias, being a police officer was more than simply a job. It was a future. Not only did it pay well, but it was also respected, and for Fareed, it was the basis around which he was constructing his entire existence with his life. He was responsible for a family and a future that he needed to ensure. There was no way that I could let this position go. In other words, if that meant patrolling a deserted beach in the midst of a winter storm, then that is exactly what he would do without hesitation. He acknowledged that there were going to be aspects of the job that would be quite inconvenient for him. To put it simply, he was completely unaware of how miserable this particular evening was going to become. It was a phone call that brought them out here in the first place. This was the reason why they were here. Someone had called the station a little while ago, and their voice was hurried and a little bit scared because of the situation. They reported that they had saw something peculiar lying on the beach, close to the waterline. Despite the fact that they were unsure of what it was, they thought it appeared to be a person when viewed in the dim light. It is a body. At this point, Antelias was a tranquil location. The occurrence of violent crime was virtually unheard of. There were more than just bodies that were discovered washed up on the strand. In light of this, Fareed and his companion were skeptical as they made their way through the sand, their flashlight beams making unsteady circles in the darkness. According to Fareed, it was most likely just some trash that had washed up on the shore, or it could have been a gigantic dead marine monster. It was more than anything else that he was irritated. Being called out into this storm for something that was almost certainly going to be of no consequence seemed like a waste of time during that moment. The idea that they were going to discover a human body on the beach was completely out of the question. Then, however, as they continued to stroll, something drew the attention of their lights. A shadowy figure was laying unmoving on the sand at a considerable distance from the beach. It was nothing more than a lump in the darkness, a mere item. Nevertheless, even from a much greater distance, there was an indisputably human quality to its appearance. This was the perfect shape. This was the perfect size. There was an instantaneous disappearance of the annoyance that Fareed had been experiencing, and in its stead was a chilly knot of dread in his stomach. This was the end. This is what the person who called came upon. He and his partner shared a glance with one another. They chose not to flee. You do not behave in such manner. You have no idea who or what is waiting for you at this moment. In the event that this was in fact a person, and if something unfortunate had occurred to them, the person responsible might still be in the vicinity, keeping a watchful eye from the rocks or the dunes. They moved at a measured pace as they approached each other carefully. They continued to keep their headlamps on, looking at everything from the breaking waves on one side to the dark and murky dunes on the other side of the region. But there was nobody on the beach. Anything else that was out of place was not present. The only things that could be seen on the sand in front of them were the wind, the rain, and that solitary person. Fareed's expertise as a police officer took control as they approached closer, but his mind was still having trouble accepting what his eyes were witnessing. Now, he was able to make out additional details. the physical form of a torso, arms, and legs. This is most certainly a person, he thought to himself. In the sand, there is a body that is resting on its back. On the other hand, there was a peculiarity about it. The manner in which it was laid was not natural in any sense. He was unable to pinpoint exactly what it was, but the proportions did not seem to be quite right. Simply put, the silhouette was unexpected. At long last, the individuals were standing immediately above it. In order to shed light on the situation, they directed both of their flashlight beams downward. And it was at that precise time that Farid realized why the body had appeared to be so peculiar. I have no doubt that it was a person. The body of a man was found there. But he was very lacking in his head. The scene was shocking to see. There was no longer any possibility that the person had drowned by accident or suffered some other kind of catastrophe. The decapitation revealed a story that was both plain and terrible. It was a murderous act. Someone had murdered this man, subjected him to this heinous act, and then either dumped his body on this beach or tossed him into the water so that he would wash up on the coast. The most heinous form of foul play was being committed here. Farid and his companion plunged straight into the process, despite the fact that their hearts were beating extremely fast. It was necessary for them to safeguard the scene. As they drew their service guns, the metal was cold and heavy in their hands, and they conducted a search that was both more extensive and more comprehensive in the local vicinity. There was a search conducted behind the rocks, in the sand dunes, and anywhere else that someone might be hiding. But there was no one present. With the exception of the two of them and the gloomy discovery that was lying at their feet, the beach was entirely quiet and empty. They returned to the body while the rain continued to fall, and the light from their flashlights created a small, isolated bubble of light in the wide blackness that surrounded them. The two of them began conversing, their voices low and intense, as they attempted to determine what their next step would be. Now, you need to keep in mind that this took place in a little community in Lebanon in the middle of the 1960s. Their law enforcement agency was not a large high-tech enterprise that covered a large area. A small force with few resources, they were a formidable adversary. They were unable to call for assistance or notify a forensics team because they did not have radios. They were just unable to provide the kind of comprehensive response that would be expected in the event of a homicide in the modern era. It would be necessary for one of them to really walk all the way back to the station, file a report, and rally the other police in order to initiate any kind of inquiry. It was a laborious and time-consuming process. On top of that, killings were so uncommon in this area that they did not even have a conventional procedure for dealing with them. In a very literal sense, they were making it up as they went along to get what they wanted. As they stood over the body and discussed the various choices available to them, a plan started to take shape. To do so was the only reasonable course of action. It was necessary for one of them to remain here with the body. In order to ensure that the murderer would not return for any reason, they were required to keep a watchful eye on the crime scene and make certain that it was not altered in any way. It would be necessary for the other officer to make the arduous journey back to the station in order to initiate the formal investigation. By the time dawn rolled around, the objective was to have a full team of investigators back here. On the other hand, this meant that one of them would have to spend the entire night on this icy, storm-tossed beach by themselves next to a headless body. The two officers exchanged glances with one another. Both back then and now, it was a rule that was never explicitly stated. All of the challenging tasks are given to the junior man. Farid was the inferior officer in the hierarchy. It was immediately apparent that he was going to be the one to take on this dreadful responsibility. He recalled the things that he had always told himself about this work from the beginning. He was in need of it, despite the fact that it would be uncomfortable. He was in need of the income. It didn't matter how terrible the responsibility was, he couldn't afford to lose his job because he refused to perform it. In response, Farid simply nodded his head as his companion looked at him with a questioning expression on his face. He said, "Fine," with his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm fine. I'll stay here." I'll watch the body. You go get the investigation started. I'll see you in the morning. After his buddy had departed, Farid felt the whole weight of the situation come crashing down on him. His silhouette was swiftly swallowed up by the rain and the darkness. Now he was all by himself. His realization of what he was going to have to accomplish over the next few hours was a terrifying experience. There were other factors at play as well, such as the bitterly low temperatures and the pouring rain. The fact that he was standing guard over a person who had been murdered was the catalyst. This barren expanse of sand was an area that he was sharing with a deceased individual. In addition to that, there was the persistent and nagging fear that was present. There is a possibility that the individual who committed this crime, who murdered this man and severed his head, is still at large. It was true that they had conducted a search, but it was not absolutely certain that the murderer was not hiding someplace close and keeping an eye on him. It was not the cold that caused the shiver to run down his spine, rather it was the thought that caused it. What would happen if they returned? What would happen if they desired to influence the body in a different way? What would happen if they regarded him as a potential danger or a witness who needed to be suppressed? Farid was currently protecting the evidence, but he was also a possible target for the investigation. It was the stuff that nightmares are made of. Still, he made an effort to stabilize himself. Reminding himself that he had been trained as a police officer, he said. In no way was he helpless. He was holding his assigned handgun, which was securely ensconced in its holster. On his belt was the service knife that he carried. If someone did emerge from the shadows with the intention of attacking him, he would be able to protect himself. He was capable of holding his own. This was a mantra that he chanted to himself over and over again in order to combat the fear. The hours passed by glacially. There was never a sign of relief. Farid felt the force of it pressing down on him, and he shook violently. It was expected of him to remain cautious, keeping a watchful eye on the crime scene and being aware. On the contrary, sleep was not even a possibility. On the other hand, he was so miserable, so thoroughly fatigued, and so incredibly cold. In an effort to preserve the meager amount of body heat that he still possessed, he found himself lowering down onto the wet sand, drawing his knees to his chest, and putting his arms around himself. In the midst of this pitiful circumstance, all he was doing was attempting to locate a sliver of solace. And he did that at some point in time. In spite of the fact that he was freezing and terrified, as well as the fact that there was a dead body only a few feet away, he became so comfortable that his body betrayed him. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning when Farid Jabber finally succumbed to sleep. After some time had passed, he suddenly awoke with a start. The pounding of his heart could be felt in his chest. Suddenly, he was overcome with a rush of utter panic. It was immediately apparent to him that he had committed a grave error. It was not appropriate for him to go to sleep. During the course of the inquiry into the murder, he was meant to be protecting the body, which is the single most significant piece of evidence of all. He recalled his anxiety about the possibility that the murderer may return. Additionally, he had just dozed off, leaving the location in a state of utter vulnerability. His thoughts were racing as he struggled to get to his feet. His eyes swept the area. It was still dark, it was still raining, and the temperature was quite chilly. His flashlight was directed at the location where the body was supposed to be, and he turned around to face it. And there was no one present at the location. The physique had vanished. Fear was his first instinct, and it was pure and basic. The perpetrator of the crime was present. It is likely that they sneaked up on him while he was sleeping and managed to steal his body. Perhaps they are still in the vicinity. Without thinking, he grabbed for his firearm, and his hand went to the holster that was attached to his hip. But the only thing his fingertips discovered was leather that was empty. He had his revolver removed from his holster, which was exposed. Suddenly, the horror was a reality now. He had been left to watch a crime scene, and in the span of a few hours, he had been able to disarm himself and find the body of the person who had been murdered. It was the end of his career. This man was a shame. However, at this moment, his primary priority was to ensure his own survival. Even though the murderer had been here close enough to steal his pistol, it is possible that he is still keeping an eye on him. Thankfully, he was still in possession of his knife. He removed it from its sheath, the blade shining brightly in the dim light that was present. Only that was left for him to do. He gripped it firmly while his eyes darted around the beach, which was at night. Where do I begin? Frantically, he pondered about it. Do you know where the body is? Where can I find my firearm? As soon as he realized the dreadful truth, his mind began searching for plausible reasons, anything other than the truth. Perhaps it was an animal, he pondered. Perhaps a giant animal emerged and pulled the body away from the scene. Through the use of his flashlight, he searched the sand for any signs of drag marks. In contrast, there was nothing. Although part of it would have been washed away by the rain, there ought to have been some evidence of it. Aside from that, what kind of animal would remove a handgun from its holster after carefully unclipping it? It was completely illogical. After then, he had another thought. The current. It's possible that a strong wave had collided with the shore, snatched the body, and then dragged it back out into the ocean. Both the absence of drag marks and the fact that it had vanished would be explained by this. But he looked at the spot where he had been resting, which was only a few feet away from the location where the body had been. In the event that a wave that was large enough to move the body of a fully grown man had come up, it would have most certainly hit him as well. It would have saturated him while simultaneously waking him up in an instant. Once more, it did not provide an explanation for the missing gun. A gun that was protected by a holster could not be removed by a wave. At long last, the horrifying realization entered the picture. One answer was the only one that could account for all of the data. Someone had arrived at this location while he was sleeping. A person had picked up the body and relocated it to a different location. During the time that he was sleeping, someone had reached over him and seized his gun. For the entirety of the night, he had been dreading the worst-case scenario, and it had finally come true. The perpetrator of the crime had made his return, and he had slept through it all. It was earlier that night, before Fareed and his partner had even arrived, and this is what had actually taken place earlier that evening. An individual by the name of Habib Jabber, who was Fareed's own cousin, had been strolling down the beach by himself. Perhaps he was just going for a walk to get his thoughts organized, but we don't know for sure why he was there. On the other hand, he was assaulted while he was there. A person ambushed him with the intention of robbing him. The thief ended up killing Habib after something went wrong, which led to a struggle between the two of them. Next, the murderer severed Habib's head, either out of a state of fear or possibly for some other more sinister motive. Although he left his headless body on the sand, he removed the head of Habib as well as the money that he had stolen, and then he returned to his home, which was located in close proximity to the beach. However, after a few hours had passed, the murderer began to feel anxious as he was sitting in his home. He was sorry for his error. The decision to abandon the body was a poor one. It was a substantial piece of evidence that could be identified as belonging to him with relative ease. His decision was that he needed to return. The body needed to be retrieved and disposed of in the appropriate manner, and he needed to get rid of all the evidence for good. So he walked back to the beach, which was the location where the crime had occurred. On the other hand, when he arrived, he witnessed something that caused his blood to turn ice cold. Not only was the body no longer by itself, it was now being protected by a law enforcement officer. Fareed Jabber, the victim's cousin, was the officer who was responsible for the murder, even though the perpetrator was unaware of this fact. It is essential to comprehend that Fareed was unaware of the identity of the victim during the entirety of this narrative. All he was aware of was the fact that a man had been killed in the incident. It was impossible for him to identify the body as belonging to his own cousin, Habib, because the head was missing from the body. The only thing he thought was that it was a stranger. Now, when the murderer noticed Fareed standing watch, his initial reaction was to turn around and flee the dangerous situation. It was a failure of his plan. It was impossible for him to reach the body. However, he made the decision to creep a little bit closer in order to observe what was taking place. In addition, while he observed the scene from the shadows, he came to an astounding realization. It was discovered that Farid, the police officer, had slept off while on the job. He was given the opportunity. Keeping a low profile, the murderer approached the scene of the crime in complete silence. During the time that Farid was sleeping, he picked up the body of Habib and carried it away, heading back towards his house at the extremity of the beach. Following that, he returned for a second time. It was then that he realized Farid, who was still asleep, had a service weapon concealed in his holster. This was an opportunity that he simply could not let go of. With great care and in complete silence, he removed the clip from the holster, eased the revolver out, and then took it as well. The fact that Farid was outwitted and disarmed by the murderer while he was sleeping is, in all actuality, the worst thing that he could have possibly imagined happening to him. The killer had now brought the body, the head, and Farid's gun back to his house, which was located farther down the beach. In his latest scheme, he intended to ignite a massive fire and destroy everything. The evidence should be completely destroyed. As a result, he began making preparations. Immediately, he reached for an axe and started chopping up firewood right there at the edge of the beach, not too far away from where Farid was resting. At that very instant, when the murderer was chopping wood, Farid awoke in a condition of complete and utter panic, having come to the realization that both his body and his pistol had vanished entirely. He was in a state of utter desperation. Eventually, he was able to spot him despite the rain. Chopping wood is a man who may be seen at the very end of the beach. This man was completely unknown to Farid at this point. There was no doubt in his mind that he was unaware that this was the individual who had just committed the murder of his cousin and taken his service weapon. In Farid's eyes, this was nothing more than a man who lived in the neighborhood. Farid's head, however, was filled with an idea as he struggled to find a solution. He lives in such close proximity to the location of the incident. Possibly, he witnessed something. Perhaps he picked up on something. Assuming he was able to assist him in locating the deceased individual and his firearm, he might be able to save his career. As a result, Farid began going along the beach while holding his own service knife. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was about to come face to face with the person who had murdered his cousin. Let's fast forward a few hours to the morning of the following day. At long last, the storm had subsided, and a light that was a light gray in color was seen spreading across the sky. Farid's companion went back to the shore, and this time he wasn't wandering about by himself. Additionally, he was accompanied by a small group of investigators who were prepared to initiate the official investigation. As they got closer to the location, his companion peered down the beach and noticed a solitary individual standing on the sand near to what appeared to be a decapitated body lying on the ground. In the beginning, he experienced a rush of relief. First, there was Farid, and then there was the body, he thought to himself. The scene is safe to be in. The appearance is exactly the same as it was when I left it. However, as they became closer to one another, the partner began to become aware of things that were not right. Squinting, he attempted to make sense of what he was seeing by focusing his eyes. It was wearing the improper clothes when the body was found lying on the ground. The victim had been wearing clothes that were completely different from what they had been wearing the previous evening. He had no doubts about it. Where did this place come from? This intriguing disparity was just the beginning of the situation. When the partner and the detectives eventually arrived at the body and got a close look at it, it was impossible to deny why they had found it. This was not the same body that had been found the previous evening. The clothing was not the only factor. Someone else was the one in question. Despite the fact that the partner was unaware of it at the time, this was not the body of Farid's cousin. However, it was determined that it was not Farid's body. At that very moment, Farid was standing right there next to it, seeming pale and very fatigued. In point of fact, it would come out that the scene that morning appeared to be was almost entirely different from what it actually was. Together with the detectives, the partner was required to spend the remainder of the day conducting a thorough investigation of the entire beach as well as the village that was adjacent to it. They also had to conduct dozens of interviews with anyone who might have seen or heard anything. Piece by excruciating piece, they pieced together the story in a slow and methodical manner. And because the fact that they discovered was so odd and so perverted, it would soon become a topic of discussion in newspapers all across the world. For the reason that Farid had approached the man who was chopping wood when he was walking down that beach, he was so overwhelmed by his desire to keep his work that he had approached him. When he had questioned him if he had seen anything weird, he had inquired as to whether or not he knew what had happened to the body that had been there just a few hours before. Undoubtedly, the man pretended to be a fool. Yes, he was the murderer. He had no intention of admitting guilt. In addition, while they were standing there conversing, Farid's thoughts started to construct a new concept that was extremely dreadful. His life was ruined. It was the end of his career. But then, he turned his attention to this stranger, this man who was standing on a beach that was completely empty. Nobody else was in the vicinity. Not a single witness was present. Farid was still in possession of his knife. During that time of complete and utter dread and the need to protect himself, he made a terrible decision. In his mind, he pondered, what if I simply replace the body? Nobody will ever be aware of it. That is just what Farid did in this situation. It was with his knife that he attacked the man, and he ended up killing him. After that, in a gruesome reiteration of the initial act, he severed his head from his body and dragged it back to the beach where it had been at the beginning. In an effort to save his own employment, he was attempting to construct the scenario in such a way that it appeared as though nothing had changed. When his colleague and the cops came, he was standing there close to the body of the man he had just killed. He had only just finished killing him. He was going to act as if he had been watching over the situation during the entire night. However, Farid had no way of knowing that the random man he picked to kill in order to cover up his error was not at all a random man. He had no means of knowing this beforehand. It was the same individual who had just a few hours earlier been responsible for the death of his cousin, Habib. It was completely unknown to Farid. When he was trying to save himself, he believed that he was killing a total stranger. However, in a surprising and inexplicable turn of events, he had genuinely and unintentionally avenged the death of his cousin. Nevertheless, the fact that justice had been delivered in a convoluted and circuitous manner did not alter the reality of the situation. Even yet, Farid Jabber had committed the heinous crime of murdering a man. He was taken into custody for the crime of murder. His frantic effort to rescue his work had not only been unsuccessful, but it had also transformed him into a murderer himself, destroying the very life that he had been so terrified of losing. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up? On the morning of the 16th of May, 2006, at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, a woman called Allison Rivera, who was 35 years old, abruptly repositioned herself in her bed. She was at her residence in Baltimore, Maryland, and the alarm for the house security system was going off on high volume. Now, despite the fact that that information was shocking, she was not entirely taken aback by it. The explanation for this is that the alarm had actually sounded at a time that was practically identical to the time it had sounded the night before. Despite the fact that the bedroom was completely black, Allison was able to make out the silhouette of her husband, Ray, as he climbed out of bed and immediately grabbed a baseball bat. Immediately after that, he hurriedly exited the room and made his way down the stairs. As soon as she stood up, Allison followed closely behind him. They turned on the lights and had a look around as they reached the bottom of the steps, in spite of the fact that the alarm was still blaring. It appeared to Allison that there was no one inside their home. All of the doors were closed and secured firmly. However, as she turned her attention to a certain window, she noticed that it was slightly open, albeit just a very small amount. Again, this was hardly a complete and utter surprise. The previous evening, when the alarm had sounded, they had contacted the authorities to report the incident. The authorities had arrived and examined the location. However, despite the fact that they did not find anyone, they did find that this particular window had been tampered with. For some reason, it appeared as though someone had attempted to force it open, which is what triggered the alarm. At this point, it appeared as though it had occurred once more. However, on that initial night, the police did not believe that it was a real attempt to break into the building. Allison and Ray had been informed by them that the alarm was most likely an alarm that was set off by a squirrel. It's a squirrel. At the time, Allison and Ray thought that was a little bit crazy, but the cops looked pretty convinced about it, and it was a logical enough explanation, so they had just accepted it when they heard it. They went back to bed after making sure the window was shut, turning off the alarm, and then going back to bed. On the other hand, here they were, 24 hours later, standing in the same position. The alarm was going off once more, and that window was obviously up once more. The concept that a squirrel would be doing this 2 nights in a row at the same time seemed very implausible to me. Something didn't feel quite right. Both Allison and Ray couldn't help but have the feeling that the authorities could have been mistaken. It's possible that this wasn't a squirrel. Presumably, this was an individual who was attempting to enter their residence. In point of fact, Allison had this nagging anxiety in the back of her mind about what might be going on, and she simply couldn't seem to shake it. She was concerned that her husband, Ray, may be the target of an assassination attempt. It is important to note that Ray and Allison had just recently relocated to Baltimore. It was because Ray had been offered a position at Stansbury and Associates, a financial investing firm located in the city, that they decided to relocate. One of Ray's special responsibilities was to compose the email newsletter for the company. Through this newsletter, subscribers were provided with guidance on purchasing and selling stocks. But here was the issue that arose. Actually, Ray had no idea what she was doing when it came to investing. The only thing he had experience with was screenwriting and freelance videography. He had no background in money. The only reason he had even the slightest chance of getting this position was because the company was owned by one of his close friends, and that buddy had hired him as a favor. In light of this, it is fair to say that some of the financial guidance that Ray was offering in this newsletter was, to put it bluntly, bad, despite the fact that he was doing his best. And it was highly probable that a great deal of money had been lost by individuals as a result of it. As a result, Allison had the impression that it was feasible for one of these irate and dissatisfied subscribers to have discovered their address and was now attempting to exact revenge on Ray. However, despite this, that was a very bizarre and conspiratorial theory. Consequently, on this particular evening, when the alarm went off for the second time, Allison did not share any of her concerns with Ray. She simply strolled over and switched off the alarm system instead of doing anything else. During the time that she was doing that, Ray went through the entire house, carefully inspecting each and every room. After that, he proceeded to check that the window was closed as securely as it could be. After then, Allison inquired of Ray whether or not they ought to make another attempt to contact the authorities. On the other hand, Ray just declined. As the police had stated, he informed her that it was quite probable that it was only a squirrel once more. He gave her the assurance that the house was secure and that they were no longer in danger. He suggested that they should sleep for a while longer. So, despite the fact that Allison was experiencing a great deal of unease with the entire situation, she accepted. Both of them then returned to the upper floor and went back to their respective beds. Allison sat down at the table in their dining room early the following morning, and she started eating the meal that Ray had prepared for her in a hurry. She was about to embark on a trip for professional reasons. The journey to Virginia would take her 3 hours, and she needed to be on the road as soon as possible. Consequently, once she had finished her meal, she disposed of her plate in the sink, and Ray took her suitcase to her vehicle without her having to struggle. I love yous were spoken between them as they stood by the car for a few period. After that, Allison got in the car and drove away, waving to Ray as she drove away from the home when she left. After waiting for 3 hours, Allison finally arrived in Virginia. The entire day was spent working, and she eventually checked into her hotel at approximately 6:30 inches the evening. She had been working the entire day. When she reached this stage, Allison was so worn out that she was on the verge of collapsing onto the bed of the motel. She only desired to make a phone call to Ray in order to check in, then perhaps watch a little bit of television before retiring for the night. Following that, she pulled out her phone and dialed his number. There were a couple rings on the phone, but after that, it simply went to his voicemail every time. That was weird, to say the least. It took her a few minutes to wait before she attempted to call once more. Nevertheless, the same thing took place. Repeatedly, it rang, and then it went to the voicemail section. This was indeed a unique occurrence. In a normal situation, Ray would always answer his phone, and he was surely anticipating a call from her about this time to let him know that she had arrived safely and checked in. However, Allison suddenly recalled something that helped her feel a little bit better about the situation. A woman by the name of Claudia, who was one of her coworkers, was actually staying with them at their home in Baltimore where they were staying. Due to the fact that Claudia was merely passing through the region and in need of a place to spend the night, she was present beside Ray. Allison made the decision to give Claudia a call. Immediately, Claudia picked up the phone. When Allison inquired as to whether or not Ray was present, Claudia responded with a statement that was somewhat unexpected. It was a couple of hours earlier, so around between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening, she stated that Ray had been arriving at the residence. While Claudia was staying in the guest room, he was working on his computer in his office, which was located down the hall from its location. Claudia reported that she heard Ray's mobile phone ringing when she was in the guest room. Just a few seconds into the discussion, she heard him remark, "Oh shit." After that, Ray allegedly ran out of the house in a literal sense, as stated by Claudia. He picked up the phone and began talking to her. She heard him get into his car, and then she heard the car drive away from their area. She was able to pinpoint the exact moment when the automobile left. In her conversation with Allison, Claudia revealed that she was clueless about his whereabouts and that he had not yet returned. It is clear that Allison was perplexed when she heard all of this, but she did not immediately become anxious about the situation. She reasoned that whatever it was that had caused Ray to hurry out of the house in such a manner was most likely some type of emergency that occurred at work or even with his friends or family. Despite the fact that it might be a terrible thing, she presumed that Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he had the opportunity to do so. Allison expressed her gratitude to Claudia while making an effort to avoid appearing anxious. Once she had finished speaking, she hung up the phone and began getting ready for bed. And while she was getting dressed, she had her phone right next to her, monitoring it, and waiting for the call from Ray that she was certain would arrive any moment now. She was certain that the call arrived at any moment. Allison was awakened the following morning at 5:30 a.m. by the sound of her phone ringing through her ears. An instantaneous surge of optimism swept over her. The fact that she eventually called to explain what was going on led her to believe that it was Ray. However, when she looked at the screen of her phone, she discovered that Claudia had called her once more. In spite of this, she pondered, well, maybe Claudia is with Ray at this very moment. She may be calling to let me know that everything is great and that she will explain everything to me. Perhaps she has some new information to share with me. Therefore, Allison answered the phone and asked Claudia, "Hey, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" Claudia responded by saying, "Your husband has not yet returned home. I have no idea what is going on with him, but I have to leave now. I have to go to the airport." Allison then continued to ask Claudia about her husband. Having reached this stage, Allison was no longer able to conceal the fear that was in her voice. It was impossible for her to contain her anxiety. As for Ray, what exactly was going on? That he would stay out all night, that he would ignore all of her calls, and that he would still not be home was utterly different from his usual behavior. What was going on was completely unknown to her. Claudia appeared to be aware of her anxiety and was in the process of requesting whether or not she should remain and wait for Ray to return home. However, Allison informed her, "No, go ahead, go to the airport, do what you need to do. I'm going to cancel
my work trip. I'm coming home right now. I have to figure out what's going on with Ray. Soon after Allison finished her phone call, she hurled all of her belongings back into her luggage and walked away. She left the hotel and started the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore after she had checked out of the hotel. To the best of her ability, she managed to maintain her composure while driving. However, she was contacting Ray's mobile phone for the majority of the time, and she did so repeatedly. And he never spoke back to me. As time went on, she eventually reached a point where the phone would no longer ring when she called. If he answered, it would immediately be sent to his voicemail. This indicated that his phone had been turned off at this point, or alternatively, the battery may have died. And it was at that moment that Allison was unable to maintain control of her panic disorder any longer. She was aware on a fundamental level that there was a significant problem. She had a hypothesis that it was connected to the job that her husband was doing at the time. She was unable to provide any evidence to support her claim, but she had the impression that something terrible had taken place. The remainder of that lengthy drive was spent by Allison making frantic phone calls to each and everyone she could think of. She made a phone call to Ray's place of employment. All of his pals were contacted by her. He was contacted by members of his family. She questioned each and every person to determine whether or not they had received a message from him, or whether or not they had called him the previous evening and said something that could have frightened him. In every case. She spoke to a number of people, but they all stated the same thing. They were unable to locate or communicate with Ray. After what seemed like an eternity, Allison was finally able to turn onto her neighborhood, and she felt a glimmer of hope. When she arrived at her home, she was hoping that Ray's car would be parked in the driveway, that Ray would be inside, and that he would have some strange narrative that would explain everything that had happened. Not at all. When she arrived, his automobile was nowhere to be found. No one was inside the house. Additionally, she was quite positive, with a surety that shook her to her very core, that there was unquestionably something wrong. As a result, she made a complete about-face, got back into her vehicle, and proceeded to drive straight to the police station. Nevertheless, when Allison went to the police and reported that her husband was missing, it became almost immediately apparent to her that the authorities were not actually that concerned about the situation. They believed that Ray was an adult who had left the house of his own free will. This was their interpretation of the situation. On top of that, he hadn't even been absent for a complete 24 hours yet. Allison's report was taken down by the police, and they did, in fact, tell her that they would look for him, but she had the impression that they were not quite as concerned as she was. On the other hand, the friends and family of Allison and Ray were undoubtedly concerned. As the days progressed, they all made their way to Baltimore in order to show their support for Allison and to assist in the search for Ray. In their search for him or his vehicle, they traveled all over the city, but they were unable to find any trace of him or his vehicle anywhere they went. They made a call to all of the local hospitals and inquired about any John Does who could have been brought in, but none of the descriptions that were provided fit Ray. They also reviewed Ray's bank records, but they found that he had not used any of his credit or debit cards since he had vanished. Moreover, as the days went by, Allison continued to feel more and more hopeless because she had not received any fresh information or any updates from the authorities. After what seemed like an eternity, Ray finally began searching through her own home one afternoon, a few of days after she had went missing for the first time. She was searching for any hint, any clue at all, that might provide her with information about where Ray had gone. After some time had passed, she made her way into the office where Ray had been working on his computer when Claudia had heard him yell and run out of the home. And there, on Ray's desk, she discovered something peculiar. This was in that room. I was looking at a piece of paper that had been folded up into a very small size. It had been taped to the back of his computer monitor, and it was wrapped in a piece of plastic before being attached to it. As a result, Allison gently pulled off the tape, opened up the container, and unfolded the paper using the appropriate technique. What she discovered was a letter that had been typed. The actual contents of the letter made absolutely no sense at all, despite the fact that it was addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. In it, There was a mention to a secret club that was referred to as the Council. It discussed secrets and a game of some kind. Additionally, it included 3 different listings. Technologies such as Bluetooth and Wi-Fi were included on one of the lists. There was another list that contained a collection of movie titles that appeared to be utterly arbitrary. Not only did the third list contain the names of genuine people, but it also contained the names of famous people and members of Ray's own family and friends. Now, if a random person were to look at this note, they would probably have thought that it was very disjointed about itself. One could even consider it to be a probable sign of a severe mental disorder of some type. To Allison, however, it did not appear to be written in that manner. She was aware of the fact that Ray had a particular fascination with conspiracies and hidden societies, but she did it from a creative perspective. When she initially read it, she experienced a brief moment of perplexity. However, she eventually came to the conclusion that perhaps this paper was simply him gathering ideas for a new script that he was working on. In the event that he was attempting to create a script on this thing that was referred to as the Council, whatever that was, she would not have been surprised in the least. The manner in which the letter was printed, folded up to such a small size, and then taped to the back of the computer was something that brought Allison a great deal of astonishment. Simply put, it appeared to be so strange and so covert. When Allison arrived at the police station, she took the note with her and gave it to the officer who was in charge of Ray's case. It was received as evidence by the police, who also informed her that they would be in touch with her regarding the matter. However, they did not communicate with one another. However, despite the passage of several days, Ray did not appear and the authorities did not provide any new information. And as a result, Allison was completely at a loss for what else to do. However, on May 22nd, which is 6 days after Ray vanished, Allison received a phone call from her parents. At the time, she was at home listening to the news. They informed her that they had been searching the city for Ray and that they had discovered something when they were operating their vehicle. A few minutes later, Allison's vehicle slid into a parking lot in the central business district of Baltimore. She parked her vehicle in close proximity to the vehicle that belonged to her parents. The entire region was teeming with law enforcement personnel and people driving news vans. Allison had the ability to see what everyone else was looking at despite the hectic swarm of people that she was surrounded by. This was Ray's vehicle. As a result, Allison stepped out of her vehicle and ran to the nearest police officer, where she inquired about the situation's current state of affairs. After her parents had seen Ray's car, they informed her that they had reached out to the authorities to report the incident. Due to the fact that officers had arrived to conduct an investigation, they saw that Ray's vehicle had a parking ticket displayed on the windshield. It was evident from the ticket that the vehicle had been parked in this lot for a period of 6 days. Therefore, it had been present since the evening of the 16th of May. Since the same night that Ray had vanished, this indicated that his vehicle had been here in this particular lot right here in this very location. Ray's personal items, such as his phone and his money clip, were not found inside the vehicle, according to the officer who informed her of this fact. In addition, there was no evidence of a break-in, thus it did not appear as though they had been taken from the vehicle. Therefore, it seemed as though on the night that Ray vanished, he had driven here, parked in this lot, and gotten out of his vehicle. This was the initial impression that was given. However, following that, nobody was aware of what had transpired with him. Allison's terror and panic reached a whole new level the moment she made this revelation. Furthermore, it appeared to make both the authorities and the general public regard the disappearance of Ray with a great deal more seriousness. Suddenly, it seemed as though people from all across the city were searching for Ray throughout the entire city. A volunteer search group made the decision to go up onto the roof of a downtown parking garage on May 24th, which was now 8 days after Ray had been reported missing. This was 2 days after the initial report of her disappearance. In order to assist them in their quest for Ray, they desired to have a more comprehensive perspective of the city. When they reached the top of the mountain, they witnessed something that, if it had anything to do with Ray, was extremely, really dark. Because of this, they quickly dialed the police number. A historic structure known as the Belvedere was located just next to this parking garage. It was once a luxurious hotel, but it has since been converted into a condominium complex. At the point where it reached its tallest position, the main part of the Belvedere was 13 floors vertical. But in addition to that, it was connected to a smaller piece that was still a part of the building, and this section was just 2 stories tall. They were able to see the main Belvedere building from the top of the parking garage where the search team was located. However, if they looked down, they could also see the roof of the smaller 2-story section of the structure. And while they were on that roof, they noticed 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a mobile phone, and a hole in the roof that was quite evident. A detective by the name of Michael Bayer and a group of Baltimore police officers were following a concierge down a hallway within the Belvedere building during the span of an hour. When Detective Bayer and his crew had initially arrived, they had spoken with the workers of the building about a hole that was located in the roof of that 2-story part. On the other hand, none of them had any idea what the police were explaining. An explanation was provided by the staff members that the section of the structure that appeared to have the hole was in fact closed off and had been for a considerable amount of time. It would appear that nobody, or at least not any member of the staff, had visited that particular location in the recent past. As a result, they were unable to determine whether or not there was a hole in that area. Nobody knew for sure, but there was a possibility. To add insult to injury, not a single member of the staff or resident had reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary in the past week and a half. As a result, there was no evidence to suggest that any injury had been sustained anywhere within the structure. However, at this point, the concierge was directing Detective Bayer and his team around a number of meandering hallways and through a number of locked doors until they eventually arrived at the room that corresponded to the location of the hole in the roof. Additionally, as soon as the door to that room was unlocked by the concierge, Detective Bayer and his crew were confronted with a foul odor. Once inside, they went. One could tell that it had been a conference room in the past because it was a very large room that was completely empty. Ray Rivera's body was illuminated by the light that was coming down from the hole in the ceiling. The light was shining right on her. Around Ray, who was laying on the floor with her face up, dried blood was all around her. He had a mutilated body there. Because of the severity of the break, the bones of one of his legs were protruding at strange angles. In addition to this, he had fallen into a state of extreme decomposition, which was definitely the cause of the foul odor. Initially, Detective Bayer was examining the body of Ray. He then turned his attention to the hole in the roof, and he said to himself, okay, it is obvious that Ray fell through the roof and landed here. Using that method, he was able to enter this locked room. The roof was broken by his entrance. However, after conducting a more thorough examination of the hole, as well as the items that the search party had observed on the roof, such as the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then later on, when they performed an autopsy on Ray's body, they came to the conclusion that it was physically impossible for Ray to have entered this room through the hole. This is due to the fact that there were only 3 conceivable locations on the roof of the Belvedere from which Ray might have dropped or jumped in order to arrive at that particular location with her landing. In addition, when you compared them to the evidence that the police had, none of them made any sense at all. There was a potential that Ray had either fallen or jumped from the very top of the main Belvedere building, which is 13 floors tall. This was the initial scenario. His shattered legs, broken skull, and broken ribs were among the catastrophic injuries that were discovered during the autopsy. It is certain that he would have died as a result of a fall from that height, which would have also caused the injuries that were discovered. The hole in the roof of the second story was located 45 feet away from the edge of the roof of the 13th story, which was located from the horizontal. From a physics perspective, it was practically impossible that Ray could have somehow gotten a running start, leaped off the roof as hard as he could, and carried himself 45 feet forward before plunging down and hitting the roof. A person would not be able to jump that far, because it is simply too far away. The second hypothesis was that Ray had possibly fallen out of a decorative ledge that could be found on the 11th level of the Belvedere. This ledge was thin, and looped around the exterior of the building. It is possible that Ray would have landed in the location where the hole was if he had fallen from that height. On the other hand, it was not possible to reach that ledge without first passing through a condo or office that was privately owned and located on that floor. In order for Ray to enter one of those secret areas, she would have needed to be physically allowed to do so. On the other hand, no one in any part of the building had reported seeing him or having any kind of confrontation with him. There was also the possibility that Ray had jumped off the top of the parking garage where the search team had been present. This was the third scenario. The distance between them was close enough horizontally that if he had jumped, he would have been able to land in the same location as the hole. However, the very highest point of that parking garage was just around 20 feet over the roof of the Belvedere, which was located on the second floor. Even if a fall of 20 feet is definitely high enough to do substantial harm to your body, it is not a fall that is high enough to cause the severe injuries that were discovered on Ray's body. It was simply not a drop that was long enough. And then, to make this whole situation even stranger, when the police examined those items that were found on the roof next to the hole, they discovered that all of the items were not scattered around, as if he had blasted through the roof and everything had just flown off of him. This was the case with Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and his cell phone. On the contrary, they appeared to be arranged in a manner that was somewhat planned and were arranged in a nice manner on the roof, almost as if they had been set there on purpose. Additionally, neither Ray's spectacles nor his phone were in any way harmed in the incident. Therefore, it was only natural to wonder how something like this could have taken place. Simply put, what caused him to collapse in the first place? And even if you were able to determine the source of his fall, you would still be unable to explain how his personal items were able to be arranged so neatly on the roof without being damaged in any way. It simply did not make any sense at all. And as a result, the authorities were at a loss for what to make of all of this. Consequently, they refocused their attention on a completely new piece of evidence, which was the peculiar note that Allison had discovered affixed to the back of Ray's computer in their residence. In the hope that it would provide them with some information, they forwarded that memo to the FBI for examination. It did, in fact. When the FBI returned, they stated that based on the message, it was highly likely that Ray was suffering from mental illness and was going through some kind of psychotic episode at the time that he wrote it. Their statement was that this was not a screenplay. The fact that he was experiencing this was evidence that something was severely wrong in his head. It was a bit of a comfort for the police, even though this did not completely explain all of the questions that they had. It appeared to provide a general explanation of a scenario that was extremely convoluted and hard to understand. In essence, this was sufficient for the Baltimore Police Department to cease their investigation, despite the fact that they did not officially conclude the case. And they informed Ray's wife Allison and her family that Ray's death, as strange as it was, and even though they didn't really know how it happened, they did know that it was most likely a suicide. They also reported that they knew that Ray had committed himself. Allison, on the other hand, was not at all content with this specific answer. To begin, it did not provide an explanation to the fundamental question of where Ray had fallen from. That appeared to be a situation that needed to be resolved as soon as possible. Irrespective of the fact that she was totally certain that Ray had not committed suicide, she did not believe that he suffered from any form of mental illness. In Allison's perspective, her husband was murdered, and it was quite likely that his job was the reason for his death. In this very moment, he was acting as if he were some kind of investment genius, and he was sending out these tips into that email that she and he both knew were, in essence, fake. The subject of investing was completely foreign to him. There was a possibility that the subscribers might be taken advantage of in a significant way. Many people were following his recommendations, and as a result, they might be losing a significant amount of money. Consequently, it appeared to her that it was not out of the question that someone who was upset with him for the poor advice he had given had gone after him. Furthermore, in addition to the notion that this was not an act of self-harm, there was that peculiar phone call, which added to the notion that something negative had occurred to Ray from an external source. When he shouted, "Oh shit," and then raced out of the home, Claudia, their acquaintance, had overheard him speak on the phone. Claudia had overheard him take the call. Specifically, the police were able to track down the call in question. Stansbury and Associates, the investment business to which Ray was employed, was the source of the information. No matter how hard they tried, they were never able to determine who had phoned him or why they had called him in the first place. As soon as the investigators started asking questions at the company, Stansbury and Associates engaged attorneys and instructed all of its employees to keep quiet about what had occurred, not even to the police. This was done because the company wanted to protect its reputation. This is the reason why the case of Ray Rivera has not been formally solved until this day. On the other hand, the individual who made that last phone call to Ray is still missing somewhere in the world. When Ray hurried out of his house in a panic that night, this individual must know the reason why he did so. And they might even know who was responsible for his death or how he passed away. However, as of this moment, that individual has not stepped forward. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the evening of the 12th of February, 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez was pacing back and forth inside a radio station in Quito, the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and the handful of people with him were working frantically to prepare for a broadcast. This wasn't just any broadcast. It was an urgent one. Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was one of the most respected and influential news sources in the entire country. The station was owned by a very popular newspaper called El Comercio. For most people living in Ecuador at the time, if you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you were either listening to Radio Quito or reading El Comercio. Or maybe both. Running a station with that kind of reputation was a huge point of pride for Leonardo. He had grown up in Quito, and he took his job very, very seriously. And that was why tonight was so important to him. He was about to deliver a broadcast that he believed could change lives all across the city. Just thinking about the weight of this moment was making his palms sweat and his stomach churn. In the room with Leonardo was a small team of producers and sound technicians, along with one of the station's best news anchors. Most of their last-minute work involved organizing big stacks of paper. These papers had all the instructions for what to say and what to do during this very important broadcast. The anchor was looking over the script one last time. He was the one who had actually written it, and he was the one who would be reading it live on the air in just a few minutes. Leonardo glanced anxiously at the clock on the wall. It was already a little bit after 9 o'clock at night, and they were running out of time. Even though Leonardo felt this intense urge to get things started, he knew he couldn't rush it. He had to give his anchor the time he needed to be 100% ready before they went live. They only had one chance to get this right. So, instead of telling the anchor to hurry up, Leonardo just bit his lip and kept pacing. He tried to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently playing over the station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance by a very famous singing duo named Benitez and Valencia. In the 1940s in Ecuador, these two singers were incredibly popular. They were like the biggest stars of their time. So when people in Quito heard that Benitez and Valencia were performing on the radio, pretty much everyone would stop what they were doing and tune in. Back then, nobody in Quito had a television. The radio was the ultimate source of entertainment and news. It was the center of everything. But radios were also expensive, a luxury item that not every family could afford. So what would happen is, people who did own a radio would often bring it outside onto the street or open their windows. That way, their neighbors and people walking by could also listen to the programs and the music. Leonardo knew exactly what this meant. At this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio listening to that performance. He needed to get his special broadcast on the air while he still had a captive audience. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair. It was a small signal, but it meant he was ready. Leonardo knew it was time. He turned and gave a sharp nod to his technicians. They were all sitting at a long table covered with knobs, wires, and broadcasting equipment. One of them saw Leonardo's signal, leaned forward, and adjusted several knobs on the control panel. Then, he pressed a single button. The instant he did, the beautiful voices of the singing duo were cut off mid-song. A large red sign on the wall above the control table lit up, and in bright letters it said "On Air." They were about to interrupt the most popular show on the radio to deliver their message, and they knew it would catch everyone in Quito completely off guard. The anchor leaned into his microphone. In a serious, urgent voice, he announced that they were interrupting the musical program for a developing story. He said there was an alarming event happening that everyone in Quito needed to hear about. Then he paused for effect before explaining the reason for the interruption. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, a 17-year-old named Jose Antonio was standing outside a restaurant with a group of his friends. Jose, his friends, and all the people eating at the tables outside had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio. They were all enjoying the music of Benitez and Valencia when it suddenly stopped. Then the announcer came on, his voice filled with gravity, saying that their country was under attack. As Jose and the others stood there completely stunned, the announcer's voice got more emphatic. He said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." At that, Jose's mouth dropped open. A jolt of pure fear shot through his chest. Latacunga was a city only about 60 miles south of Quito. Instinctively, Jose and everyone around him leaned in closer to the radio. They needed to hear more. They needed to know what was happening and why. But just as they leaned in, the broadcast stopped just as abruptly as it had started. The music program came back on the air, as if nothing had happened. The street fell silent. Jose and the crowd of people just stood there, waiting. Nobody knew how to react. A few people started looking up at the sky, as if they expected to see warplanes flying overhead. Jose found himself doing the same thing, scanning the dark night sky, wondering what would happen next. But there were no planes. There were no signs of war, nothing to indicate that whatever had destroyed Latacunga was now approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the faint echo of other radios around the city, all of them now playing the musical program again. As the seconds ticked by, the crowd slowly started talking again. Some people began to make nervous jokes, suggesting the whole thing was a prank. Others just shrugged it off and went back to their conversations and their meals, acting as if the interruption never even happened. But Jose noticed something. Some of the people sitting at the tables were still just staring at the radio. They were shifting in their seats, looking restless and uncomfortable. That broadcast had clearly struck a nerve with them. Jose couldn't shake the feeling either. He kept fidgeting and exchanging worried looks with his friends. He wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he was so worried was because a sudden invasion of their country wasn't just a fantasy. It had actually happened before. Just 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was only a kid, the much larger neighboring country of Peru had invaded Ecuador. It started as an argument over land along their shared border. But instead of settling it with words, the Peruvian army had stormed into the disputed territory and conquered it easily. The fighting had only lasted for about a month before Ecuador had to accept defeat and give up the land. Even though that fighting had never reached Quito, it had been a terrifying time for everyone living in the city. It made them realize just how vulnerable they were, how they couldn't really defend themselves against a powerful foreign invader. And then, as Jose and the others were still grappling with what to think, the music on the radio cut out again. The broadcaster's voice returned, and he said he had an update. He said the enemy had landed aircraft on the outskirts of Quito in a northern area called Cotocolao. That was only 8 miles from the city center. Suddenly, a horrible realization dawned on Jose and everyone listening. If the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south, and now they had landed in Cotocolao in the north, then the city of Quito was completely surrounded. Before Jose could even fully process that terrifying thought, another man's voice came on the radio. Unlike the first announcer, who was urgent but relatively calm, this new voice was pure panic. He identified himself as the chief of Quito's newspaper. Then he screamed into the microphone, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He kept yelling, his voice cracking with terror. He said the enemy was using poisonous gas and fire. They were killing people, destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple, chilling warning. "They're coming." Jose let out a yelp that he couldn't control. He was so overcome with sudden terror that the sound just escaped him. But he barely even heard it because all around him, everyone else was reacting the same way. The street erupted in screams, prayers, and absolute chaos. Some people started pointing up at the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy planes. More and more people poured out of buildings and homes, flooding the streets, crowding around the radios to try and get more information. They were all terrified. No one knew what was going on. Jose wanted to try and explain to the newcomers what they had heard so far, but it was impossible. Everyone was shouting over each other. It was complete madness. And on the radio, it was just as chaotic. Different voices were cutting in and out. It sounded like the news station itself was in a panic, unable to get a clear message out. But through all the noise, one word kept coming through over and over again. Hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide. Jose and some of the people around him were thinking about doing just that, about running, when a new voice took over the broadcast. This man's voice was louder, more authoritative. It immediately projected a sense of calm that cut through some of the panic, both on the radio and in the crowd. This person sounded like a government official. He introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. He confirmed that yes, cities around Quito were under attack. But, he said, he had clear directions that he wanted everyone in the city to follow. Hearing this, Jose felt a small flicker of hope. Finally, someone was in charge. Someone would tell them what to do. But that feeling didn't last long. The mayor's instructions didn't make Jose feel any better. He told the people of Quito that all women and children had to flee. They had to go hide, find somewhere safe, get away. But the men, he said, had to stay and fight. Jose felt a rush of adrenaline. He was 17. Was he old enough to be considered a man? Would he be expected to fight, or would they tell him to run away with the women and children? He didn't know. But then, a strange sense of calm came over him. He thought, we're at war and I am going to fight. He signaled to his friends a silent message that said, "Let's go. Let's get ready." The group of boys came together and started to move away from the restaurant. At that exact moment, a car came speeding down the street, narrowly missing them. Jose watched as it screeched around a corner, and then he heard a loud bang and the sickening crunch of metal hitting stone. Immediately, some men ran towards the sound of the crash to see if they could help. But other people were running in the opposite direction. For Jose and his friends, it was impossible to know what to do. Should they go help with the car crash? Or should they try to find the front lines wherever they were? At the same time, women were running past, clutching their children. Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble by, her face contorted in pain as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, mixed with the frantic sound of boots pounding on the cobblestone streets as people ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way to go when another speaker's voice came on the radio. He announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically the person in charge of security for the entire country. And what he said next extinguished any last bit of hope. The Minister of Government said to forget what the mayor had told them about fighting. He said that Ecuador's weapons were not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. The minister was essentially saying that they were going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was a man talking very fast, and he said he was reporting live from the ground in Quito. He screamed into his microphone for everyone to run. And then, his feed just cut out. The original announcer came back on, his voice shaking, and said that the reporter who had just been speaking had been killed. It was now 9:21 p.m. Only 21 minutes had passed since the broadcast had first started. And in that short time, the entire city had spiraled into total madness. Remember, Jose was still gathered with his friends. They had started to leave the restaurant, but so much had happened so fast that they were just kind of frozen there on the sidewalk, not sure what to do next. As they stood there, Jose noticed a change. All the people who had been hesitating, who had just been sitting or standing near the radios, it was like they all got up at once and just started running. Running to the churches to pray. Running to their homes to get their families. The entire city was in a full-blown panic. Jose saw families running out of their houses, dragging suitcases and whatever belongings they could carry, getting ready to evacuate. But where could they even go? The broadcast had said they were surrounded. Just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering. He looked over and saw a few people at the restaurant's bar, grabbing bottles of liquor from the shelves. They were pouring themselves drinks and then just tossing the empty bottles on the floor. Jose looked around for his friends and realized they had gone. He was standing there, all alone. He knew he couldn't just stand there anymore. He had to do something. He had to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life one last time. A voice was calling out a final update. But the chaos all around him was so loud with all the screaming and running that Jose couldn't understand what this final update was. He just didn't hear it. But he could see that other people had heard it. And he could see their reaction. They stopped. Everyone just stopped running. They put down their suitcases. They stopped screaming. And everyone just kind of stood there for a moment. And then they started going for their guns and their knives and their torches. A huge crowd, now armed, came together. And then they all began to move as one, all heading in the same direction towards the city center. Inside the Radio Quito station in the city center, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update. The one that Jose hadn't heard, but that had made everyone else stop panicking and get angry. A minute later, Leonardo heard the sound of glass shattering somewhere on the floor below him. Then he heard a loud crackling sound. He smelled smoke. The air inside the studio in front of him was starting to get hazy. And then, from the street outside the building, he heard someone yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, the anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on the air for anyone who was listening to please come and help. The radio station was in trouble. But there was no one left to help them. They were on their own. When Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out. They ran together out of the studio and down the stairs towards the exit. But before they could even get to the bottom of the staircase, the smoke from the fire became so thick that they couldn't breathe. Leonardo realized the entire first floor must be engulfed in flames. The only way out was not down, but up. So Leonardo led the group back the way they came. They ran back up through the second floor offices and the studio where they had just recorded the broadcast. They headed up the stairs to the very top floor of the building. By the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear horrible, painful screams coming from somewhere below him. He hoped his coworkers had managed to follow him, but there was so much smoke in the building now that he couldn't see anything. He didn't know who was with him and who had been left behind. The roar of the fire was getting louder every second. It was so hot that sweat was pouring down Leonardo's face, stinging his eyes. He instinctively ran away from the thickest smoke, towards the windows. Because they were on the top floor, 3 stories up, he had a clear view of the ground below. He saw huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches, and they seemed to be running around in a frenzy. He saw big military tanks rolling in behind them, and a hazy mist, some kind of gas, was flowing through the crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake. He frantically tried to think of a way out, a way to escape, and that's when he saw it. The roof next door. The radio station was right next to a school which was not yet on fire. The school building wasn't connected to the radio station, but it was close. Close enough that Leonardo thought he might be able to open the window he was standing near, get a running start, and literally jump out of the window and land on the school's roof. Of course, if he didn't make the jump, he would fall 3 stories to the street below and die. But the alternative was to stay in the building and be burned alive. So Leonardo opened the window. He backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and he jumped. He flew through the air, his arms flailing, willing himself to reach the school roof. After a split second in the air, he came crashing down, slamming hard onto the roof of the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he was alive. He had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste. He didn't have time to see if anyone else would try to make the jump. He felt like he was on his own. So he got up. Despite the pain from the impact, he was mostly okay. He walked across the roof of the school until he got to the next building. This building was right up against the school, so he climbed onto its roof and walked across that one until he reached the next. He was moving from roof to roof, high above the chaotic streets of Quito. Down below, he could still see the madness. The tanks, the people with torches. He still didn't really understand what was going on. Eventually, as he made his way across the rooftops, he came to a roof where a family was sitting. They were just watching the city, where the sky was glowing red from the light of the fire he had just escaped. When they saw Leonardo, they told him they had been down on the streets, in that crowd. But when it got too dangerous, they had come up here to get away. They asked Leonardo if he had done the same thing. Leonardo said no. He told them who he was, how he had gotten there, and why. And then he asked them for help. For a moment, the family just stared at him in shock. Then they started talking to each other in low voices. From what Leonardo could hear, and from the looks on their faces, they seemed angry. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. But there was one condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he go back down to the street. The father said Leonardo would have to hide in their house. Because, the father explained, everyone in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out that Leonardo's broadcast had been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he had hoped it would do. It had grabbed the attention of everyone in Quito. The whole city had stopped to listen. But there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided not to mention until the very end of the broadcast. By the time he did, it was already too late. This fact was the final update. The one Jose had been unable to hear. The one that had caused everyone on the street who did hear it to stop running and screaming and instead grab their guns and knives and torches and head for the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was that the entire broadcast was a fake. The invasion wasn't real. It was an act. A prank. A joke. The broadcast was a theatrical performance. It was an adaptation of a famous fiction novel called The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. So what Leonardo did was orchestrate this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news report about an alien invasion happening in their own country. The exact same thing had been done in the United States a few years earlier, in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was a work of fiction. And even with that warning, it still caused mass panic. So, during Leonardo's broadcast in Quito, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not relieved. They weren't amused. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they marched to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his crew were, and they set it on fire. Between the fire at the radio station and all the people who took their own lives because they genuinely believed that aliens were about to kill them, The death toll from that one night, from that one prank, was somewhere between 6 and 20 people. And many, many more people were injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive. And later in life, he would give a detailed interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he never faced any criminal charges. No jail time, nothing. But the incident completely destroyed his reputation in Ecuador. People didn't trust him anymore, and it was impossible for him to find work. Eventually, he had to leave the country and move to Venezuela. And as for Radio Quito, the once powerful and important news station, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after that night. On the evening of Sunday, the 26th of January, 1851, a 2-3-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath in the frosty air. But despite the weather, he couldn't stop smiling. He was about to do something he loved, something that made him a lot of money. And this was already the 3rd time he was doing it today. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. At this point in American history, in 1851, a phenomenon called the spiritualist movement was sweeping the nation. Huge numbers of people had come to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through gifted individuals like Bailey's. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table with all the guests who were participating. Then they would begin to summon spirits. The participants could tell when a spirit had made contact with the medium because the table they were all sitting at would start to shake or move. Sometimes a table would thump so violently that one of its legs would actually break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a sign of a huge success. Seances were a craze all over the country. Many people genuinely believed that mediums like Bailey's could talk to ghosts. But there were also lots of people who thought it was all complete nonsense. But even the non-believers would still hire people like Bailey's to perform seances at parties and gatherings. It was a form of entertainment, kind of like hiring a magician or a band for the evening. In Fall River, Massachusetts, there was a big appetite for these seances from both believers and skeptics. This was partly because many of the old homes in Fall River had histories of being haunted, so the groundwork was already laid for people to be interested. Now, to be clear, Bailey's whole seance act was a complete fake. In fact, many of the people who hired him knew in advance that it was all just a performance. They knew that Bailey's was more of an actor than a real psychic medium. But Bailey's was very, very good at faking it. He had become the go-to medium in Fall River. And to keep his business thriving, he knew he had to put his full energy into every single performance. So, on this day, as Bailey's was getting ready to start his 3rd seance of the day, he was tired. These performances were physically exhausting. But he knew he had to find a second wind and push through. He had to make this one just as good, if not better, than the others. As the homeowner of this 3rd seance opened the door and let him inside, Bailey's was sure it was going to be a great show. A few moments later, the homeowner, a man named John Gardner, led Bailey's into the living room where several other guests were already waiting. Bailey's immediately snapped into character. He made his cape swoosh as he walked in, and he waved his hand dramatically around the room to command everyone's attention. When all eyes were on him, he said in a booming voice, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped. Bailey's could tell they were going to be an enthusiastic audience, which always made the seances much more fun. They all went into the parlor and took their seats around a big circular table in the middle of the room. Bailey's dimmed the lights and walked around the table, giving his instructions. He told them all to hover their hands over the table, palms down with their fingers spread. He explained that each of them had to be touching the hands of the person sitting next to them. This, he said, would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. Once all the guests were in position, Dolentes took his own seat and did the same thing with his hands, completing the circle. Everyone was ready. He nodded, and in a commanding voice, he announced that he was now going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move the table. The room became deadly quiet. Everyone waited to see what Bailey's would do next. But Bailey's just let the tension build. He knew that the longer he waited, the more the anticipation would grow. This was his favorite part of the performance. He could feel his own heart starting to race with excitement. Finally, he broke the silence. He called out to the spirits in the room, demanding that if there was a ghost present, it should make itself known. As he said this, everyone immediately began to look around the room excitedly. This created the perfect, quick distraction that Bailey's needed to perform his first trick. Mediums at the time used a few different tools to help them fake communication with ghosts. One of those tools was a set of special hooks that they attached to their wrists, hidden under their long sleeves. When they put their hands palm down over the table, just like they told everyone else to do, those hooks would actually go underneath the table and grip the edge. This allowed the medium to lift and rattle the table without appearing to touch it at all. It actually took a lot of strength to do this. Imagine trying to move a huge, heavy table using just your wrists, while keeping your arms looking relaxed and hovering over the top. But Bailey's had gotten very good at it. So, as his guests were all looking around for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks under the table. He began to move his wrists, and the table let out a loud thump. As soon as it happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed. The other guests started laughing and getting excited. But Bailey's was just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time, and as he did, he used his strength to make the entire table rise up off the floor. All the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was doing it. He knew it was fake, but he couldn't figure out the trick. Bailey's hands were still just hovering over the table. Bailey's just ignored the man and smiled. He then said to the spirit, "If you are willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time." Then Bailey's used one of his hooks to make a single, sharp knocking sound from under the table. As he did, the woman who had screamed before jumped in her seat. She was so scared. Seeing her reaction gave Bailey's a surge of adrenaline. He was really doing a good job. So Bailey's leaned into it. He rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. He was really exerting himself now, trying his best not to show any sign of physical effort while making the table dance. He was sweating. He was yelling out to the spirits, demanding that they come forward and talk. But then, as Bailey's was in the middle of this big performance, something strange happened. He suddenly felt the room turn icy cold. He felt a weird tingling sensation flow through his entire body. He blinked, and his vision became hazy. This had never happened to him before during a seance. It was clearly having an effect on him, because he stopped his performance. He was no longer trying to communicate with the dead. He was just standing there, feeling very uneasy. It felt like the seance was actually working, like there really might be spirits in the room. Bailey's could feel everyone staring at him. He knew he couldn't ruin his business. He had to maintain the act. He couldn't just get spooked and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't seem to break out of this weird feeling. The room felt so cold. Something was wrong. He tried to move, but it was like he was frozen in place. Across the table, the homeowner, John Gardner, was just sitting there, staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what was happening. From his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from standing there awkwardly, unable to move, to then suddenly sitting down hard in his chair and lurching back into a strange position. Then, Bailey's eyes started darting all over the room. His breathing became ragged and heavy. John couldn't help but feel that it looked like Bailey's was actually possessed. For real. Then Bailey's began to speak. His voice cracked as he mumbled something that John and the others couldn't understand. John was spooked. This performance was incredibly convincing. He almost wanted to applaud. Bailey's acting was so good. But he didn't want to break the spell. Like Bailey's, John and most of his guests didn't believe seances were real at all. But Bailey's performance was turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair. The whole table thumped and shook again. Then Bailey's let out a long, ghostly-sounding moan. One of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. Instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head so that only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. This was incredible. It was actually kind of scary. But then Bailey's let out another moan and fell backwards, hard, onto the floor. For a second, there was just confused silence in the room. If this wasn't an act, then that was a violent fall. This looked too legitimate. How was Bailey's able to do this? It seemed real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something was truly wrong here, some of the guests began to scream. They started running out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He had been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and run to get him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of emergency he was responding to. But now he could see a group of people dressed for a party, all gathered around what looked like a seance table. They were pointing to the floor where a young man was lying in a crumpled heap. Doctor. Hopper went to the young man and reached out to feel his neck. There was no pulse. The doctor turned and looked at the group. He said, "He's dead." Before the group could even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on. Someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward. In a very shaky voice, he explained that the young man was a medium named Bailey Staples. He had been conducting a seance, and he had demanded that a ghost talk to the group. A moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought the seance was a fake. When they hired Bailey's, they thought it was just going to be a performance. But now, they didn't know what to think. It had all looked very real. Doctor. Hopper shook his head, not sure what to make of this story. He certainly did not believe in ghosts. But after a quick examination of Bailey's, he couldn't see any obvious cause for the young man's death. So, Doctor. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that whatever killed Bailey Staples, it wasn't a ghost. But he didn't know what it was yet. He promised them he would get to the bottom of it. By the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond. And this made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to perform basically impossible. The problem was, some people were now claiming that a ghost had possessed Bailey's, but it hadn't actually killed him. They believed the ghost had put Bailey's into a deep trance where he only appeared to be dead. They argued that if Dr. Hopper performed an autopsy on him, the autopsy itself would be what killed Bailey's. So, pretty quickly, you had all these people showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and at the local police station. They were demanding that the authorities give them Bailey's body to prevent the doctor from murdering him with an autopsy. It was a whole scene. And at the same time, this story was spreading like wildfire all over the country. At a time when people in America were already fascinated with seances, this story seemed to legitimize the idea that ghosts were real and that they could be dangerous. It just dumped gasoline on the fire of the spiritualist movement. Seances became even more popular, but now people were attending them because they felt they were real, not just for entertainment. On January 28th, 2 days after Bailey's was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead with the autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. He was looking down at Bailey's body, and he realized that to his own surprise, he was a little bit nervous. The thought kept creeping into his mind, what if this man is still alive, and I'm about to kill him? Logically, the doctor did not believe Bailey's was in a trance. but it was unsettling how physically healthy Bailey's body looked. He was young and strong, with no history of illness. And there wasn't a single mark on his body to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were some slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper knew were from the special hooks he had been wearing to lift the table. Doctor. Hopper shook off the nerves. He moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bailey's chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out that on the day Bailey Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak. He was lifting John Gardner's heavy table up off the ground, making the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Bailey's didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bailey's had a pre-existing heart condition. His passionate, energetic performance, coupled with the immense physical exertion it took to lift that heavy parlor table using only his wrists, and the fact that Bailey's had already given 2 other similar performances that same day, had caused his weak heart to swell. It developed an aneurysm, which then ruptured, causing fatal internal bleeding. Bailey Staples had basically put on the best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him. And in doing so, he accidentally convinced a whole house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.